The grease from Donald's morning bacon had cooled into a cloudy, stubborn film on the surface of the dishwater. Beatrice stood before the porcelain sink, her yellow rubber gloves squeaking against a chipped stoneware plate. The water was lukewarm now, graying at the edges where the suds had died. Through the small window above the faucet, the yellow arm of a construction crane sliced through the gray morning sky, towering over the half-built luxury condominium complex next door. The vibrations from the pile drivers, 3 blocks away, hummed through the soles of her slipsers, a faint, rhythmic thrum that shook the antique crystal goblets in the dining room cabinet. Every 20 minutes, the old Kenmore refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen shuddered, groaned, and fell into a low, rattling wheeze. It had been doing that since the winter of 2018, the year Donald, Clara, and the girls had moved in for a few months after Donald's boutique logistics firm collapsed 7 years ago. Beatrice, is there any of that good sourdough left? Clara's voice preceded her, dry and sharp, before the swinging pantry door creaked open. Clara didn't look at Beatrice. Her eyes were glued to her iPad, her thumb flicking through a digital catalog of modern mid-century minimalist sofas. She was wearing her plush, sand-colored robe, the one Beatrice had washed and dried on the delicate cycle 2 days prior. "No," Beatrice said. Her voice was quiet, a low instrument kept mostly in storage. "Donald finished it last night." Clara exhaled a thin, impatient sigh, still scrolling. "Well, we'll need more. And the oat milk is practically empty. Maeve likes the barista blend, not the cheap one in the blue carton. The blue one tastes like chalk." She reached out blindly, grabbed a clean, damp mug from the drying rack, and set it on the counter. She left her dirty breakfast plate, streaked with egg yolk and a crumpled, greasy napkin, right beside the sink, precisely 3 inches from the soapy water. Beatrice stared at the plate. A fly landed on the dried yolk. "I'll add it to the list," Beatrice murmured. "Thanks, sweetie," Clara said, already halfway out the door, her slippers dragging softly against the worn pine floorboards. "Oh, and Donald's gray suit. He needs it for the regional dinner tomorrow. It's got a small spot on the left lapel. Can you take it down to the cleaners before they close at 5? "I'd do it, but I've got Pilates at noon, and then Chloe wants to look at light fixtures." The swinging door closed. Beatrice stood still. She did not sigh. She did not clench her jaw. In her mind, she performed the familiar, silent arithmetic, the energy required to explain to Clara that the dry cleaner had changed their hours versus the energy required to simply walk the 4 blocks in the damp wind. Walking was quieter. Walking required no dialogue. She took hook off the yellow gloves, laying them perfectly parallel across the edge of the sink. The house was too large for one person, everyone always said. It was a sprawling 3-story Victorian with high ceilings, drafty hallways, and dark wood trim that gathered dust faster than a feather duster could chase it. Beatrice's grandfather had built it. Her father had died in the front parlor. Beatrice had spent her 30-year career as a quiet clerk at the county records office, coming home every evening to the silence of these rooms, until Donald's family arrived with their heavy suitcases, their loud voices, and their assumption that because Beatrice had no husband and no children, she must have an infinite capacity for storage. Beatrice picked up the wicker laundry basket from the pantry floor. It was heavy, piled high with Chloe's gym wear and Maeve's discarded sweaters. She began the climb up the back stairs. These stairs were narrow, steep, and smelled of old floor wax and damp plaster. There was one tread, the 5th from the bottom, that groaned loudly, unless you placed your foot precisely on the outer left edge. Beatrice stepped on the left edge. She had been doing it for so long she didn't even have to think about it. When she reached the 2nd floor landing, she stopped. The door to her bedroom, the large south-facing room at the end of the hall, the one with the original bay window and the view of the dying lilac bushes, was slightly ajar. A sharp, Metallic sound cut through the silence of the hallway. Shrr, clack. It was the distinct sound of a steel tape measure snapping back into its casing. If we knock down this partition, Chloe's voice was muffled but clear, carrying the light, effortless confidence of someone who had never paid a property tax bill in her life. We can easily double the size of the bathroom. We could do a freestanding soaking tub right where her wardrobe is. Beatrice stood frozen by the linen closet, the wicker basket pressed hard against her hip, the wicker weaving digging through her cardigan into her skin. "But what about the chimney breast?" Maeve asked. "That's structural, isn't it?" "We can expose the brick," Chloe replied. "The developers next door did that with their loft conversions. It adds at least 50 grand to the valuation if we sell the footprint of the garden to them for the easement and convert this floor into 2 luxury, 2 beds. We're looking at close to 2 million, easily." "Is she still downstairs?" Maeve's voice dropped, but only slightly. There was no fear in it, only the mild, administrative caution of a teenager trying not to wake a sleeping dog. "She's doing the dishes," Chloe said, her tone dismissive. "She'll be down there for an hour. You know how she is. She scrubs every single fork like it's a relic." A brief silence followed, filled only by the faint thump-thump of someone's sneaker tapping against the floorboards. Beatrice's floorboards, the ones she had hand-waxed every spring. "Do you think Dad will actually go through with it?" Maeve asked. "I mean, she's lived here her whole life. Where would she go?" "Maeve, please," Chloe said, and Beatrice could hear the eye roll in her niece's voice. "She's 62. She's already getting so slow. Have you seen her hands? She's practically a ghost in this house anyway. She doesn't even use the parlor. Dad says she'd be much happier in one of those assisted living suites over by the park. They have a shuttle bus and structured activities. Here, she's just cleaning up after us. It's actually sad." "I guess," Maeve said. "It's just the house is technically hers, right? In the will? Grandpa left it to her because she was the one who stayed behind to nurse him," Chloe said. The tape measure zipped out again. "Sure. But Dad's the executor of the estate now, and honestly, she doesn't have the money to keep this place up. Look at the roof. The gutters are rotting. She's sitting on a gold mine, and she's living like a pauper. It's a waste." Beatrice looked down at the laundry basket. On top of the pile lay one of Chloe's expensive silk blouses, the cream-colored one that required hand-washing in cold water and drying flat on a towel. Beatrice had bought the special delicate detergent for it yesterday. She had spent $4 of her own small pension on it, because Clara had mentioned the blouse was filthy, and Chloe had a job interview next week. In the dim hallway, the grandfather clock at the bottom of the stairs ticked. Talk, talk, talk. Beatrice's chest didn't heave, her heart didn't race. Instead, a peculiar icy stillness settled over her, a sudden profound drop in internal temperature. She looked at her own bedroom door. Through the 2-inch crack, she could see a sliver of Chloe's bright pink sweater. Chloe was holding a small notebook, jotting down numbers with a sleek gold pen. Beatrice calculated the energy. If she pushed the door open, she would see their faces flush. She would hear the immediate stammering excuses. "Oh, Aunt Bea, we were thinking of remodeling for you to make it easier for your knees. We want you to have a beautiful modern bathroom." Donald would get involved. Clara would look wounded. They would spend the next 3 weeks being loudly, aggressively polite to her, overcompensating, making her feel like a tyrant in her own home for having caught them. The confrontation would cost her weeks of peace. It would yield nothing but lies. Slowly, without making a sound, Beatrice stepped backward. She kept her weight on the outer left edge of the 3rd stair, then the 4th, then the 5th. She carried the heavy laundry basket back down to the dark, damp basement, where the washing machine stood beneath a single, buzzing fluorescent bulb. She set the basket down on the cold concrete floor. She did not start the wash. She sat down on the old wooden stool beside the dryer, her hands resting flat on her knees, and listened to the distant, rhythmic thump-thump of her nieces walking across the ceiling above her head, measuring her life. The cold from the concrete floor seemed to rise through the soles of Beatrice's slippers, settling into the joints of her ankles. She sat on the wooden stool for a long time, her gaze fixed on the rusty water pipe that ran along the basement ceiling. Overhead, the floorboards stopped creaking. A door slammed on the first floor, followed by the distant, muffled purr of Clara's SUV backing down the narrow driveway. Slowly, Beatrice stood up. She turned to the wicker laundry basket. Her hands, dry and lined with the pale scars of old kitchen burns, hovered over the pile. She reached past Chloe's delicate, cream-colored silk blouse. Her fingers found her own white cotton nightgowns, 3 of them, faded and thin from years of washing, and 2 pairs of thick gray wool socks. She lifted only her items out of the basket. The washing machine's lid opened with a metal clatter that echoed in the small basement. Beatrice dropped her small bundle inside. She picked up the blue plastic bottle of lavender detergent. Normally, she poured a full capful to ensure the family's clothes smelled fresh, as Clara often demanded. Today, Beatrice tilted the bottle carefully, letting only a tiny blue stream fall into the plastic cup, exactly a quarter cap, just enough for her own few things. She set the dial to small load and pulled the knob. The machine groaned, then began a slow, sputtering hiss as cold water trickled into the drum. Leaving the wicker basket with the rest of the family's laundry sitting on the concrete floor, Beatrice walked up the stairs. On the kitchen counter, Clara's dirty plate remained. The yellow yolk had dried into a hard, glossy crust. The single fly had been joined by another. Beatrice walked right past it. She did not pick up the plate. She did not run the tap. Instead, she went to the dark closet tucked beneath the main staircase. It was a cramped, wedge-shaped space that smelled of old wool, cedar blocks that had long since lost their fragrance, and the rubbery scent of Donald's golf bags. Beatrice reached into the dimness, her hand brushing against a row of heavy winter coats until she found the gray wool suit. She pulled it out into the hallway light. It was an expensive suit, bought with the first major commission Donald had earned after moving into Beatrice's house. On the left lapel, near the second buttonhole, was a dark, greasy spot about the size of a dime. Salad dressing. Normally, Beatrice would have carried the jacket into the kitchen. She would have reached for the small box of cornstarch on the pantry shelf, gently patted it onto the stain, and let it sit for 4 hours to draw the grease out of the wool fibers. She would have used a soft, bristled toothbrush to sweep the white powder away before taking it to the dry cleaners, ensuring the heat-pressing machine wouldn't bake the oil permanently into the fabric. Beatrice looked at the stain. She looked at the pantry, where the cornstarch sat behind the baking soda. She felt the weight of the wool jacket on her arm. She did not reach for the cornstarch. She simply folded the suit over her forearm untreated. "Beatrice, are you still here?" The heavy mahogany front door clicked open, and Clara stepped into the foyer. She was dressed in black athletic leggings and a fitted jacket that smelled faintly of expensive lavender body spray and synthetic sweat. Her car keys jingled in her hand, a heavy brass ring loaded with keychains from various boutique gyms. "I forgot my water flask," Clara said, her eyes scanning the console table, then shifting to her phone. She didn't look at Beatrice's face, only at the gray suit hanging over Beatrice's arm. "Oh, perfect. You got the suit. Make sure you tell Mr. Miller to rush it. Donald needs it by tomorrow evening. Tell him to pay extra attention to that spot on the lapel. Donald was furious when he did that at lunch yesterday." "I'm taking it now," Beatrice said. Clara paused, her fingers hovering over her phone screen. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, pushing them up onto her head. For a brief second, her eyes met Beatrice's, then immediately darted away toward the kitchen door. "Oh, by the way," Clara said, her voice dropping into a tone that was entirely too bright, too casual. "A colleague of Donald's, Richard, might drop by tomorrow afternoon. He's an appraiser." Beatrice stood perfectly still. The gray wool suit felt heavy on her arm. "An appraiser?" "Yes," Clara said, her smile tight and polite. She began pacing toward the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. "Just for the homeowner's insurance. You know how the neighborhood has changed. The condos next door have driven the land value through the roof, and Donald says our current policy doesn't cover the actual rebuild cost of a historic home. Richard just needs to take some quick photos of the interior rooms to document the original features." She reached the kitchen counter, picked up her forgotten metal water flask, and ignored the dirty plate with the dried egg yolk sitting right next to it. "He'll need to see the upstairs rooms especially," Clara continued, her back to Beatrice as she rinsed the flask under the tap. "Your bedroom has the best light to show the original timber framing and the bay window. I told him it wouldn't be an issue. You don't mind, do you? Just make sure the bed is made and any, well, you know, your medicine bottles and things are tucked away. We want the house to look as spacious as possible for the paperwork." Beatrice watched Clara's reflection in the dark, unlit microwave screen. Clara's hands were moving quickly, soaping the rim of the flask, her head tilted slightly away. "The insurance," Beatrice repeated. It was not a question. "Exactly," Clara said, turning around with a wide, empty smile. "It's just administrative stuff. Donald handles all of that. Thank goodness. I don't know what we'd do without him keeping track of these things. Anyway, I'm going to be late for Pilates. Don't forget the dry cleaner." The front door opened, letting in the sudden, loud rumble of a cement mixer from the street, and then closed with a heavy, rattling thud. Beatrice remained in the hallway. She looked down at the gray wool suit. The grease stain on the lapel seemed darker in the hallway light. Clara's words hung in the quiet air, sweet and hollow like rotten fruit. An insurance appraiser, documenting the original features. She knew how much the developers had paid for the corner, lot down the street. $3.2 million. The owner had been an old man, a retired postman who had lived there alone until his family moved him to a facility in the suburbs. Beatrice walked to the kitchen. She set the gray suit on the back of a wooden kitchen chair. She stood before the calendar hanging on the pantry door. It was a cheap paper calendar, a giveaway from the local hardware store, filled with Beatrice's neat pencil-written notes. Donald's dentist, 2 p.m. Maeve's car service, 9 a.m. Clara's hair appointment. She looked at the empty square for tomorrow, Tuesday. In her mind, Beatrice did not see the appraiser taking photos for insurance. She saw him taking photos for a real estate listing. She saw the floor plans being drawn. She saw the small, neat sticker she had placed on the corner of her mother's vanity drawer 30 years ago, being peeled off by a stranger. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her small leather coin purse. Inside was her debit card, the one linked to her modest state pension account, the account that had hovered around $3,000 for the last 5 years, because she consistently bought the groceries Donald and Clara forgot to reimburse her for. She took a deep breath, the air smelling of stale grease and Clara's lavender perfume. She did not go to the dry cleaners. Instead, Beatrice walked to the front closet, took her beige trench coat from its hanger, and stepped out into the cold, gray afternoon. She walked down the concrete steps, past the towering glass wall of the new condo complex, and turned toward the downtown district, toward the bank. The wind off the river carried the smell of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. Beatrice kept her head down, her chin tucked into the collar of her beige trench coat, as she walked the 4 blocks toward the commercial district. With every step, the physical changes in the neighborhood pressed in on her. The old hardware store where her father used to buy brass screws was gone. replaced by a boutique dog grooming salon with a pristine glass facade. Next to it, the bakery that had sold cheap rye bread for 50 years was now an artisanal coffee shop where a single pastry cost $8. Everything was being scrubbed clean, painted matte black or stark white, and prepared for people who looked like Chloe and Maeve. She reached the corner of Elm and 4th. The bank, once a sturdy brick building with heavy brass doors, had been bought out 3 years ago by a regional conglomerate. It was now called Apex Trust. This historic facade had been sheeted over with gray composite panels, and the brass doors had been replaced by a sterile, double-paned glass airlock that hissed as she stepped through. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of chemical carpet cleaner and ozone from the laser printers. Beatrice walked to the reception desk. A young woman with a perfectly symmetrical haircut looked up from her monitor. Her smile was instantaneous and entirely plastic. "Welcome to Apex. How can I help you today? I'd like to speak with someone about a property, deed, and equity options, please," Beatrice said. Her voice was steady. Though she kept her shoulders slightly stooped, her canvas bag held tightly against her stomach with both hands. She looked the part of an aging woman overwhelmed by her utility bills, a role she knew the bank staff would recognize instantly. "Of course. Do you have an account with us?" "I do. A personal checking account. Under Beatrice Vance." The receptionist tapped her keyboard. I can have Matthew see you in just a few minutes. If you'd like to take a seat in the waiting area." Beatrice nodded and moved to the row of minimalist blue chairs against the wall. The seat was stiff, designed to discourage long stays. She sat upright, her hands folded over her bag. Beside her, a digital screen looped a silent advertisement for home renovation loans, showing a young, laughing couple painting a bright white wall in a sunlit kitchen. Beatrice looked down at her fingernails. They were short, clean, but worn down at the tips from decades of scouring pots, pulling weeds from the garden, and hand-washing delicate fabrics. For years, she had viewed this wear as a quiet badge of service. She had believed that the clean floors, the folded laundry, and the hot dinners were her contribution to a family unit that loved her. Now she saw those worn fingertips for what they truly were, the physical record of her own slow erasure. "Miss Vance?" A young man in a navy blue suit that was slightly too large at the shoulders stepped out. Of an office, he had a short, neatly trimmed beard and held a thin black tablet. "I'm Matthew. Right this way, please." Beatrice followed him into a small, glass-walled office. The room contained 2 chairs, a desk cleared of all paper, and a single, dead orchid in a gray ceramic pot. "Please, have a seat," Matthew said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. He sat down and tapped his tablet, his eyes scanning her profile. "So I see you've been with us for quite a while, since 1994. "Yes," Beatrice said. "My father opened my first account here when it was still Valley National, a loyal customer." "We love to see that," Matthew said, his tone dripping with the polished, condescending warmth reserved for the elderly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "The receptionist mentioned you had some questions about a property deed and equity." "Yes," Beatrice said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, faded manila envelope. She laid it on the desk, but did not open it. "I own the property at 412 Alder Street. I inherited it from my parents. The deed is fully in my name. There is no mortgage." Matthew's eyebrows twitched upward. He tapped his tablet quickly, his fingers making a light, rhythmic patter against the screen. 412 Alder Street," he murmured. He stared at the screen for a moment, his eyes widening slightly. He looked up at Beatrice, his demeanor subtly shifting. The casual condescension was gone, replaced by the sharp, hungry attentiveness of a salesman who had just spotted a high-value lead. "Ah, yes, that's a very desirable pocket right now." The zoning changes last year allowed for high-density multifamily conversions on that block. "I am aware," Beatrice said softly. Miss Vance, according to our current municipal database and recent local sales, the land value alone for your parcel is estimated at approximately $2.4 million. If we factor in the structure, even with historical maintenance needs, the equity you're sitting on is substantial. Are you looking to list the property? We have several preferred partners in residential real estate who specialize in estate sales. No, Beatrice said. I have no intention of selling the house. Matthew's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I see. Well then, were you looking for a home equity line of credit? For repairs? A roof, perhaps? The Victorian properties in that district often require significant upkeep. No, Beatrice said. She leaned slightly forward, her voice remaining low, almost conspiratorial. I want to discuss a reverse mortgage. Matthew blinked. He looked at the tablet, then back at Beatrice. A reverse mortgage, he repeated. Well, Miss Vance, we do offer those products for homeowners over 62, but I must ask, do you have heirs? A reverse mortgage allows you to convert a portion of your home's equity into tax-free cash, but the loan balance increases over time. When you pass away, or if you move out of the home for more than 12 consecutive months, the bank sells the property to pay off the balance. Anything left over goes to your estate, but in many cases, especially over a long period, there is very little left. The home does not stay in the family. Beatrice sat in the warm, quiet office. She could hear the faint hum of the traffic outside through the double-paned glass. In her mind, she heard Donald's voice from last Thanksgiving, boasting to his friends about the investment potential of the Alder Street house while Beatrice was in the kitchen, scraping the turkey carcass to make soup for their lunches the next week. She saw Clara's pale, manicured fingers pointing to the master bedroom on a mental floor plan. The home does not stay in the family, Beatrice murmured, testing the weight of the words on her tongue. No, Matthew said, his tone turning cautious, almost gentle, as if he were explaining a tragedy to a child. It would be sold. Your family wouldn't inherit the property. They would have to buy out the loan to keep it, which is often financially impractical. Beatrice looked down at her manila envelope. Inside was the original deed, signed by her father. In fountain pen, the blue ink faded to a dull gray-brown. How much cash could I draw? She asked. Matthew tapped his screen again, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the tablet. Based on your age, the home's estimated valuation, and current interest rates, you could qualify for a line of credit or a lump sum of roughly $1.2 million, or we could structure it as monthly tenure payments. A lump sum, Beatrice said. Can it be deposited directly into a new private account? One that is entirely separate from my current checking? Matthew's eyes flickered. He recognized the pattern, an older relative securing funds away from the eyes of her family. He had seen it before, usually in cases of financial elder abuse, but the calm, deliberate look in Beatrice's eyes did not suggest confusion. It suggested a quiet, cold clarity. Yes, Matthew said slowly. We can certainly set up a private, single-owner, high-yield money market account for those funds. No one else would have access to it unless you explicitly sign a power of attorney. I see, Beatrice said. She took a quiet, deep breath. I would like to review the application paperwork. Please. Of course, Matthew said. He stood up, his chair scraping against the thin carpet. I'll go print the disclosure packets and the preliminary application. It will take just a moment. He left the glass office. Beatrice sat alone. She reached out and touched the cool, dead orchid in the gray ceramic pot. The leaf was stiff, dusty, and artificial. It would never grow, and it would never die. It would just sit here, looking like a flower, until someone threw it in the trash. Through the glass wall of the office, she saw Matthew standing by a large multi-function printer, waiting for her paperwork to slide out of the tray. He was checking his watch. Beatrice did not feel guilt. She did not feel anger. She felt only the steady, rhythmic ticking of her own internal clock, counting down the hours until the house on Alder Street was no longer a home but a vault. The dampness of the evening fog had settled into the Victorian's front porch by the time Beatrice returned. The wooden steps were slick under her orthotic shoes, and the brass doorknob felt ice-cold through her thin fabric gloves. Inside, the hallway was dark. The house had a way of absorbing the gray light of dusk, trapping it in the high corners of the ceiling where the plaster was cracked. Beatrice hung her damp beige trench coat in the hall closet. She took her heavy canvas bag, her fingers feeling the thick, stiff edge of the Apex Trust folder hidden inside, and carried it into the kitchen. She set the bag on the counter, right next to the dirty plate Clara had left behind that morning. The egg yolk had dried to a dark, orange-brown scab. Usually, the first thing Beatrice did upon entering the kitchen was empty the sink, wipe down the countertops, and begin prepping the family's dinner. Monday nights were historically reserved for beef stew, a 4-hour process of dicing chuck roast, peeling potatoes, and simmering carrots in a heavy iron pot so that the rich, warm scent would greet Donald when he walked through the door. Tonight, Beatrice did not open the vegetable crisper. She walked to the pantry and retrieved a single, small copper pot, just large enough to hold 1 egg. She filled it with 2 inches of cold tap water and set it on the vintage gas range. The burner caught with a sharp click-click hiss, a crown of blue flame licking the copper bottom. From the carton in the refrigerator, she took 1 white egg. She set it gently in the water. She was standing there, watching the first tiny bubbles form on the eggshell when the heavy oak front door opened. The floorboards in the foyer groaned under a familiar, heavy tread. "Aunt Bea?" Donald's voice was loud, carrying the performative exhaustion of a man who wanted everyone to know he had worked a long day. He walked into the kitchen, his tie already loosened, his leather briefcase clutched in one hand. He smelled of cold, damp wool, mints, and the stale coffee of his office. He dropped his briefcase onto the dining table, then turned toward the kitchen stove, his nostrils flaring slightly as if expecting the rich aroma of seared beef. He stopped. His eyes fell on the tiny copper pot, then shifted to the kitchen chair where his gray suit lay folded, exactly where Beatrice had left it 3 hours ago. His brow furrowed. "Aunt Bea? Did you not make it to Miller's?" Beatrice did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the water, which was beginning to ripple around the egg. "I didn't go to the dry cleaners." Donald stared at her. For a long, silent moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the rhythmic hum of the old Kenmore refrigerator. He took a step closer, his face tightening, though he quickly forced a soft, paternal smile onto his lips. The look he used when he was trying to remain patient with someone he considered simple. "Oh, did you forget?" he asked, his voice dripping with gentle condescension. "You know how important that regional dinner is tomorrow," Clara said. "She left the suit out for you right after breakfast." "I had an errand," Beatrice said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the apologetic flutter he was used to. "An errand?" Donald's smile faltered. He rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers smoothing his thinning comb-over. "Right. Well, but you know Miller's closes at 5 on Mondays. If we don't get it in today, they can't do a 24-hour rush. I'm going to have to drive down there first thing in the morning and practically beg them. It's going to cost double." He reached down and picked up the suit jacket, holding the lapel up to the dim kitchen light. He squinted at the grease spot. "Did you at least put the cornstarch on it? To pull the oil out?" "No," Beatrice said. Donald's jaw tightened. A small, nervous twitch developed at the corner of his left eye. This was a break in the machinery. For 7 years, the house had run on an invisible track. Clothes appeared in his closet, clean and pressed. Meals appeared on the table hot, and the trash vanished to the curb on Tuesday nights. To find the track broken, even in this small way, left him visibly disoriented. No? He asked, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. Why not, Aunt Bee? It only takes a second. Now the grease is just going to sit in the wool overnight. It might ruin the fabric. I was at the bank, Beatrice said. Donald stopped. His hand, still holding the gray wool lapel, remained suspended in the air. His eyes darted to the kitchen counter, landing on Beatrice's heavy canvas bag. The bank? His tone shifted instantly. The annoyance was replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. He set the jacket back down on the chair, stepping closer to her. Is there an issue with your account? The checking? You know, Aunt Bea, I've told you before. Handling those bank statements can be incredibly stressful at your age, especially with all the digital updates they're doing. It's so easy for seniors to get targeted by those online scams. He leaned against the counter, his hand coming down dangerously close to her canvas bag. If you're having trouble managing the utility bills, or if you're worried about the property tax, you just have to let me know, Donald said, his voice dropping into a warm, confidential purr. Honestly, the easiest thing would be for us to sign that power of attorney form I drafted last year. That way, I can just handle the accounts directly. You wouldn't have to walk all the way downtown in the damp weather. Save your knees. Beatrice took a metal spoon from the drawer. She gently nudged the boiling egg so it wouldn't bump against the side of the copper pot and crack. The account is fine, she said. Well then, why did you have to go all the way down there today? Donald asked. His eyes were fixed on her face, searching for a sign of confusion, of weakness. He believed, as he always had, that her silence was a symptom of a fading mind, a quiet surrender to old age. I needed to update some paperwork, Beatrice said. Donald let out a dry, nervous laugh. Paperwork, right. Well, let me know if you need me to look over whatever they gave you. You know how banks love to hide fees in the fine print. I can make sense of it for you. He looked around the empty stove, then at the dark, cold kitchen. So, what's for dinner? Are Clara and the girls eating out? I thought I smelled toast, but I'm having a boiled egg, Beatrice said. She turned off the gas. The blue flame vanished. There are more eggs in the refrigerator if you're hungry, Donald, and some bread in the pantry. Donald stood in the center of the kitchen, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked from the single egg in the small copper pot to his dirty gray suit to the empty, cold stovetop. An egg, he muttered, as if trying to translate a foreign word. Just an egg? Yes, Beatrice said. She picked up the pot, poured the boiling water into the sink, and ran a stream of cold tap water over the shell. The steam rose into her face, warm and damp, smelling of calcium and old copper. She did not look at Donald. She did not offer to make him a sandwich. She did not apologize for his suit. She simply picked up her single egg, her side plate, and her canvas bag, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her brother's son standing alone in the dim, cold room, surrounded by the dirty dishes he had never learned how to wash. The lock on Beatrice's bedroom door was a heavy brass mortise mechanism from 1894. When she turned the small iron key, it gave a deep metallic clack that felt solid, final, and entirely her own. She set her side plate on her writing desk, a small mahogany table tucked into the curve of the bay window. With deliberate, quiet movements, she peeled her boiled egg. The white shell cracked into a dozen tiny, pale shards, which she piled neatly onto a paper towel. She had brought a small twist of wax paper containing a pinch of coarse sea salt from the pantry. She dipped each bite of the warm egg into the salt, chewing slowly, staring out the dark window. Outside, the rain had finally started. It tapped against the glass panes, a cold, erratic rhythm that blurred the sharp yellow lights of the construction site next door. Once she had finished, she wiped the desk with a clean tissue, disposing of the eggshells in her small wicker wastebasket. Then she opened her canvas bag. She pulled out the thick, cream-colored folder from Apex Trust. The document at the top of the stack was printed in a crisp sans serif font. Application for home equity conversion mortgage, Hekimum. Beneath it lay the detailed schedule of fees, interest calculations, and the critical disclosure page regarding the disposal of the property upon the borrower's death. Beatrice smoothed the pages with the palm of her hand. The paper felt thick and dry. A low rumble echoed through the floorboards. It was the heavy wooden front door opening downstairs. Voices drifted up, the high, energetic chatter of Chloe and Maeve, followed by the rustle of shopping bags and the clicking of heels on the hardwood foyer. "Donald? Why is it so dark in here?" Clara's voice was sharp, carrying up the open stairwell. Beatrice did not move. She sat perfectly still at her desk, her hands resting flat on the bank documents. In the corner of her bedroom, near the cedar wardrobe, was a black, decorative iron heating grate set directly into the floorboards. In these old Victorian houses, the grates allowed the heat from the kitchen stove below to rise into the bedrooms. They also acted as perfect, natural whispering tubes. Beatrice quietly stood up, walked to the corner of the room, and knelt on the faded Persian rug. She leaned her head close to the iron scrollwork. "I don't know." Donald's voice rose from the kitchen below, muffled but entirely legible. "I told you, she just didn't do it. The suit is sitting right there on the chair, and there's no dinner." "Wait." "What?" Chloe's voice had a whiny, petulant edge. "There's nothing to eat? I've been at the design center since noon. I'm starving." "There are eggs," Donald said, his voice dripping with his own frustration. "And bread, that's what she had." She boiled herself an egg and went upstairs, locked her door. "Locked it?" Clara asked. A cabinet door slammed shut. She never locks her door. "Donald, did you two get into an argument?" "No, I told you. She was just strange, cold. She said she was at the bank updating paperwork. When I offered to look over it for her, she completely shut down. She wouldn't even let me see her bag." A brief silence descended on the kitchen below. Beatrice could hear the distinct sound of a spoon scraping against a cardboard carton. Someone was eating yogurt. "Do you think she's starting to slip?" Maeve asked softly. "Like, mentally? My friend Sarah's grandmother started doing stuff like that, forgetting to cook, hiding her purse, getting paranoid about her money." "Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me," Chloe said. "She's 62, but she lives like she's 80. She doesn't have any hobbies. She doesn't go anywhere. Her mind is probably just stagnating. It's actually really sad." "If she's losing her cognitive faculties," Clara said, her voice dropping into a low, confidential hiss that Beatrice had to strain to hear, "we need to be very careful." "Donald, did you call Richard? Is he still coming tomorrow?" "Yes," Donald said. 2:00. He's going to do the walkthrough. I told him we're just doing an insurance update, so he'll keep it casual. He won't make a big deal out of taking the photos." "Good," Clara said, "because if she's starting to decline, we need to get the appraisal done and the property valuation secured before. Well, before she's not legally cleared to sign anything. If we have to go through a court-ordered conservatorship to sell the house, it will take months. The developers next door aren't going to wait forever. They'll just buy the Miller lot instead." "I know," Donald muttered. "I'll handle it. I'll make sure I'm here when Richard arrives. I'll keep her downstairs in the parlor so he can do the upstairs bedrooms without her hovering." Beatrice knelt on the cold floor, her ear pressed to the dark iron grate. The smell of dust, old soot, and the faint aroma of the tea Clara was brewing floated up to her. Her mind did not race, her pulse did not quicken. She performed a silent, familiar calculation. Over 7 years, she had spent roughly $400 a month on groceries for them. She had paid the water bill, the gas bill, and the garbage collection fees out of her own pocket because Donald forgot his checkbook and Clara was between transfers. 7 years, 84 months. That was nearly $35,000 of her own limited savings, poured into the maintenance of 4 adult lives, and in return, they were planning to use her own aging mind as a legal lever to pry her out of her father's house. Beatrice stood up. Her knees made a dry, cracking sound in the quiet room. She walked back to her writing desk. She picked up her old Parker fountain pen, the one her father had given her when she graduated high school, its black resin barrel worn smooth by decades of her fingers. She unscrewed the cap, the brass threads turning with a satisfying heavy precision. She turned to page 4 of the Apex Trust application. The box labeled Lump Sum Disbursement was small and white. Beatrice carefully placed the nib of her pen inside the square and drew a neat dark blue X. Beneath it, on the line marked Primary Borrower Signature, she wrote her name in her elegant old-fashioned cursive, Beatrice Clara Vance. She did not hesitate. The ink flowed smoothly onto the thick paper, drying almost instantly in the warm air of her bedroom. She slid the completed application back into the manila envelope. Tomorrow, when the appraiser arrived at 2 o'clock, she would not be sitting in the parlor being managed by Donald. She would be downtown, handing this envelope back to Matthew. The house on Alder Street was indeed a gold mine, just as Chloe had said, but they had forgotten one fundamental rule of mining. The gold belonged to the person who held the deed. Beatrice turned off her desk lamp, plunging her bedroom into a deep, velvety darkness. The rain continued to lash against the glass, a cold, relentless shield between her and the whispers below. The gray, watery light of Tuesday morning did not so much illuminate the kitchen as make its neglect more visible. Beatrice came down the stairs at exactly 6:30, her wool-socked feet making no sound on the wooden steps. The air in the lower half of the house was cold, smelling of the damp soot in the parlor fireplace and the sour, sweet scent of the raspberry yogurt Clara had eaten the night before. The empty plastic container sat on the kitchen island, a sticky pink spoon resting inside it, attracting a small swarm of fruit flies. In years past, Beatrice's morning routine was a silent ballet of efficiency. By 6:45, the automatic drip machine would be gurgling, filling the kitchen with the rich, dark aroma of hazelnut coffee. A basket of warm toast, wrapped in a linen napkin, would be sitting on the table alongside a small dish of butter and a jar of orange marmalade. Today, Beatrice did not touch the coffee maker. She took a small black cast iron kettle from the lower cabinet. She rinsed it under the tap, filled it with exactly 1 cup of water, and set it on the small burner of the stove. She retrieved her mother's porcelain teacup, the one with the faded gold rim, and placed a single tea bag of English breakfast inside. While she waited for the kettle to whistle, she wiped the small wooden cutting board she had used the night before, with a rag dipped in warm water and white vinegar. The sharp, clean scent of the vinegar cut through the heavy, stale air of the kitchen. A door creaked upstairs, followed by the hurried, heavy thud of Donald's footsteps. He was running late. When he entered the kitchen, he was wearing an older navy suit that was slightly tight around his waist. His hair was damp and combed back flat, and his tie was lopsided. In his left hand, he held the hanger carrying his dirty gray suit, the grease spot on the lapel looking like a dark, bruised eye in the morning light. He stopped at the threshold. His eyes darted immediately to the automatic coffee maker. It was dry, dark, and empty. "Aunt Bea," he asked, his voice thick with sleep and early morning panic. Is the coffee maker broken?" "No," Beatrice said, her back to him as she watched the first wisp of steam escape the kettle's spout. "It works." "Oh," Donald said. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty machine, then at the dirty yogurt cup on the island, then back at Beatrice. He rubbed his eyes. "Well, did you not make any? I'm running incredibly late. I have to get to Miller's before they open at 7:30 to beg him for the rush." "I only wanted tea this morning," Beatrice said. The kettle began to hiss, a low, rising whistle. She lifted it off the flame and poured the boiling water into her porcelain cup. The dark tea leaves bled into the water, turning it a deep, rich amber. Donald let out a sharp, incredulous breath. He set his dirty suit on the back of a kitchen chair, careful to keep it away from Clara's sticky yogurt spoon, and approached the coffee machine himself. He pulled open the cabinet where the filters were kept, his fingers fumbling with the paper cones. He had lived in this house for 7 years, yet he handled the simple plastic coffee scoop as if it were a complex medical instrument. "How many scoops do you usually use?" he muttered, his voice tight. 2? 3? 2 for a small pot," Beatrice said, holding her warm teacup in both hands. 4 if you want it strong." Donald dumped 3 heaping, uneven spoonfuls into the filter, spilling dark coffee grounds across the clean white laminate counter. He poured water into the reservoir from a plastic cup, splashing it over the side. He slammed the lid shut and hit the switch. The machine began to hiss and pop, but the water he had poured was cold, and the brewing process would take twice as long as usual. "I don't have time for this," Donald whispered, checking his wrist. His left eye twitched twice, a tiny, involuntary flutter of skin. He turned back to Beatrice, trying to smooth his features into a warm, reasonable expression. "Listen, Aunt Bea, Clara told you about Richard coming today, right? The insurance appraiser?" "Yes," Beatrice said, taking a slow sip of her tea. "Great. He'll be here at exactly 2. It's just a formality, like Clara said. But, well, you know how these insurance guys are. They get very, very particular about clutter. If the house looks crowded, they think it's a fire hazard, and they raise our premiums." He stepped closer, leaning against the counter, his navy sleeve brushing against the spilled coffee grounds. "So, I think the best thing is if you just stay downstairs. Maybe relax in the parlor. I can have Clara set you up with some tea and your favorite puzzle. We just want to let Richard do his work quickly without, having to explain everything to him. It's much easier if I handle him." "You want me out of the way," Beatrice said. Donald's face flushed a deep, dull red. He laughed, a high, strained sound that bounced off the high ceiling. "Out of the way? No, Aunt Bea, of course not. We just don't want you to have to climb all those stairs with him. It's a big house, and he's going to be poking into all the closets. It's just a lot of physical effort for you. We're thinking of your knees." Beatrice looked down into her teacup. Her reflection was dark and distorted in the amber liquid. She calculated the distance from the front porch to the downtown branch of Apex Trust. 4 blocks. If she left at 1:30, she would arrive precisely at 1:45. She would be sitting in Matthew's office, handing him the signed reverse mortgage papers, while Donald was ushering his appraiser up her back stairs to measure her bedroom for a condominium conversion. "I understand," Beatrice said softly. "Wonderful," Donald said, his relief so palpable his shoulders visibly dropped. He reached out and patted her arm, a brief, patronizing touch that made her skin crawl beneath her cardigan. "I knew you'd understand. We just want to make things easy for you." The coffee machine finished its cycle, dripping a pale, thin, watery brown liquid into the glass carafe. Donald poured it into a travel mug, didn't bother to wipe up the spilled grounds on the counter, and grabbed his dirty gray suit from the chair. "I'm running," he said, his keys jingling in his hand. "I'll see you this afternoon, Aunt Bea. Don't worry about a thing." The heavy front door slammed shut. Beatrice stood in the silent kitchen. She looked at the counter where the dark coffee grounds lay scattered like black dirt across her clean white laminate. She looked at the watery coffee Donald had left behind. She did not clean up the grounds. She picked up her porcelain cup, walked back to her writing desk in her bedroom, and locked the door behind her once again. She had exactly 5 hours before she needed to walk to the bank, and for the first time in 7 years, she had absolutely nothing she was required to do for anyone else. By 12:30 in the afternoon, The rain had tapered off into a thick, clinging mist that hung low over the rooftops. Upstairs in her bedroom, Beatrice dressed with meticulous care. She chose her dark charcoal wool skirt and a clean cream-colored blouse. She did not wear her house apron, the faded blue cotton one with the pockets stuffed with lint, stray buttons, and twist ties that she had worn almost every day for 7 years. She stood before her vanity mirror, slowly brushing her gray hair back into its neat, tight bun. In her reflection, she noticed the faint, pale line on her ring finger where her skin had grown thick. She had never married, but she had worn her mother's silver band there for years until her knuckles had swelled. Now her hands were bare. She picked up the large, brown manila envelope containing the Apex Trust paperwork. It fit perfectly into her structured black leather handbag, a bag she had bought herself for her retirement 15 years ago and rarely used. As she unlocked her bedroom door and stepped onto the landing, she was met by the sharp, synthetic scent of artificial eucalyptus. Downstairs, the parlor was a hive of quiet, anxious activity. Beatrice descended the stairs slowly, her hand gliding along the polished mahogany banister. Through the wide archway of the parlor, she saw Chloe standing on a velvet-cushioned footstool. Chloe's hands were wrapped around the base of the Victorian bronze and porcelain mantel clock, a heavy, delicate timepiece that Beatrice's grandfather had received as a wedding present in 1898. "Be careful with that," Maeve warned, standing below her sister with her arms crossed. "If you drop it, Aunt Bee will have a stroke." "It's fine," Chloe muttered, her face flushed with effort as she lifted the heavy bronze clock. "It's just so dusty and dark. It makes the whole fireplace look like a funeral home, and that ticking is so loud. It's like a heartbeat. Richard will think the house is a museum." Maeve reached onto the mantelpiece and set down a small glass jar filled with pale wooden sticks, the source of the cloying eucalyptus smell. "There, that's better. It smells like a spa." Beatrice stood in the doorway. Clara was sitting on the edge of the sofa, a yellow microfiber cloth in her hand, frantically wiping down the side table. When she looked up and saw Beatrice standing there, dressed in her formal charcoal skirt and holding her black leather handbag, she froze. "Beatrice!" Clara's voice jumped a half octave. She quickly dropped the dusty cloth behind a throw pillow. You're dressed. Are you going somewhere?" On the footstool, Chloe turned her head, still clutching the heavy bronze clock against her chest. Her eyes darted from Beatrice to the clock, and then down to her own feet. Her expression was a mix of guilt and defiance, like a child caught with her hand in the sugar jar. "I have an errand," Beatrice said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of the apologetic flutter they expected. "But Donald said you were going to stay in the parlor this afternoon," Clara said, stepping forward. She wiped her hands nervously on her jeans, her eyes scanning Beatrice's neat appearance. "The appraiser, Richard, will be here at 2. We really need you here, sweetie, just in case he has questions about the history of the house. Or the plumbing. Donald doesn't know where the main water shutoff is." Beatrice looked at her sister-in-law. Clara's eyes were darting toward Beatrice's black handbag, searching for some clue as to where she was going. "The water shutoff is in the basement, behind the coal bunker," Beatrice said. "Donald has lived here for 7 years. He should know where it is." Clara's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "And the clock," Beatrice added, her eyes shifting to Chloe, who was still awkwardly holding the heavy bronze antique on the footstool. "You can put it in the hall closet. Or the basement. Put it wherever you think it looks best." Chloe and Maeve exchanged a quick, bewildered look. Normally, if anyone so much as touched the grandfather clock or the mantelpieces, Beatrice would intervene immediately. She would take a soft microfiber cloth, carefully wipe their fingerprints away, and deliver a gentle but firm lecture on the delicate nature of 19th century French escapements. Her complete indifference to the clock's removal was more jarring than if she had screamed. Are you sure? Chloe asked, her voice dropping its confident edge. We can leave it if it's going to upset you. It doesn't upset me, Beatrice said. She turned away from the parlor archway and walked toward the front closet. She retrieved her beige trench coat and slipped her arms into the sleeves, buttoning it up to her throat. Clara followed her into the foyer, her slippers dragging on the runner rug. Beatrice, really, it's misting out there. It's freezing. Why don't you let Donald take you wherever you need to go tomorrow? He has a break between meetings in the morning. He can drive you. Beatrice picked up her handbag. She looked at Clara, really looked at her. She saw the tiny, expensive lines around Clara's eyes, the expensive highlights in her hair, and the faint, permanent crease between her brows that came from years of wanting things she couldn't afford. Over 7 years, Beatrice had calculated every penny she had saved by not going to restaurants, by not buying new clothes, by repairing her own shoes. She had done it so there would be enough in her checking account to pay the heating oil bill. When Donald's business was restructuring, she had starved her own life to keep theirs warm. Donald has his own meetings, Beatrice said, and the walk will do my knees good. But Richard, Clara began, her hand reaching out as if to physically stop Beatrice from opening the door. The house is unlocked, Beatrice said, her hand already on the cold brass handle. You have the keys. Richard can look at whatever he needs to look at. My room is tidy. She opened the door. The damp, chilly mist rolled into the foyer, smelling of wet asphalt and dead leaves. I'll be back before dinner, Beatrice said. What should we do about dinner? Clara called out, her voice rising in a panic as Beatrice stepped onto the porch. Is there stew? Donald said. You bought carrots. Beatrice didn't look back. The carrots are in the crisper, Clara. You'll have to peel them yourself. She closed the heavy oak door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place was muffled by the thick fog, but to Beatrice, it sounded like an iron gate sliding shut. She turned her collar up against the cold, damp air and walked down the steps, her black leather handbag held tightly under her arm, heading toward Elm Street. The double-paned glass doors of Apex Trust hissed closed behind Beatrice, shutting out the damp hum of the city. She walked past the reception desk, her wet shoes squeaking softly on the hard blue carpet. At the water dispenser in the corner, she took a tiny paper cup, filled it with cold water, and drank it down in 3 small, measured swallows. The water tasted metallic, sharp with chlorine, but it cleared the sticky eucalyptus scent that seemed to have clung to the back of her throat. Miss Vance. Perfect timing. Matthew stepped out of his glass-walled office. Today, his navy suit jacket was unbuttoned, and he carried a thin blue folder. He looked slightly more hurried than he had yesterday, his eyes darting to a clock on the wall before gesturing for her to follow him. Right this way, he said. Inside his office, the dead orchid in the gray ceramic pot had been replaced by a small, thriving green succulent. The soil in the pot looked dark and damp. Beatrice sat in the same stiff, minimalist chair, placing her black leather handbag on her lap. She unzipped it, took out the thick manila envelope, and slid it across the clean glass desk. I've completed the application, Beatrice said. Matthew picked up the envelope. He opened it with a silver letter opener, sliding the documents out with a crisp, dry rustle. His fingers, tipped with clean, manicured nails, flipped directly to the 4th page. He stopped when he saw the blue ink X in the box for lump sum disbursement. His gaze moved down to her neat, cursive signature. You're entirely certain about the lump sum? Matthew asked, looking up at her over the edge of the papers. I only ask because a line of credit or monthly tenure payments often provides a more stable cushion. For seniors, a lump sum is a very large amount of cash to manage all at once. I am certain, Beatrice said. I have several. outstanding family expenses to clear, and some travel plans. Travel, Matthew repeated, a small, polite smile returning to his face. Well, you certainly have the equity for it. Let me just run the final title search to make sure there are no outstanding liens or municipal claims on the property. He turned to his computer, his fingers tapping the keys in a rapid, practiced rhythm. The screen cast a cool, pale blue light across his face. Beatrice sat in silence. She listened to the quiet, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the keyboard, a sound that reminded her of her own years at the county records office. She had spent 3 decades typing names, dates, and parcel numbers into similar databases, watching the ownership of the county shift from old families to new developers, one digital entry at a time. All right, Matthew said, squinting at the monitor. The title search is completely clear. No outstanding mortgages, no tax liens, no secondary claims. The property at 412 Alder Street belongs entirely to you, Miss Vance. You have the sole legal authority to encumber the estate. I know, Beatrice said. The next step, Matthew continued, leaning back in his chair, is the appraisal. Under the HUD guidelines for a home equity conversion mortgage, we are required to send an independent, certified appraiser to inspect the property. They need to verify the structural integrity, check the square footage, and document any deferred maintenance that might affect the valuation. He opened his calendar on his screen. We have an approved appraiser, a Mr. Henderson, who can do the walkthrough next Tuesday morning. Say 10 o'clock? Would that work for you? Yes, Beatrice said. Next Tuesday at 10 is fine. Perfect. I should remind you, Miss Vance, that the appraiser will need access to every room in the house. The attic, the basement, all the bedrooms. It's a thorough process. We'll need to make sure the family, your nephew and his household, are cooperative. Beatrice folded her hands over her handbag. They will be cooperative. But I should tell you, there may be another appraiser at the house today. Matthew's fingers froze over his tablet. He looked up, his brow furrowing. Another appraiser? Are you working with another lender? No, Beatrice said. She kept her voice very soft, almost conversational. My nephew has arranged for a friend of his, a real estate appraiser named Richard, to take photos of the house today at 2 o'clock. My nephew told me it was for an insurance update. Matthew stared at her for a moment. A flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. The sharp, professional recognition of a family dynamic that was rapidly heading toward a collision. He had seen many variations of this during his years at the bank. Children trying to secure an estate before an aging parent could spend it, or parents quietly protecting their assets from greedy heirs. He didn't ask for details, and Beatrice didn't offer any. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the low hum of the office's air conditioning. I see, Matthew said slowly. He made a small, neat note on his tablet with his stylus. Well, just to be absolutely clear, any appraisal ordered by your nephew or his associates will have no legal standing with Apex Trust. Our mortgage is contingent entirely on the report from our independent appraiser. Mr. Henderson, if Mr. Henderson finds any evidence of structural changes or renovations that haven't been approved by the county, it could affect the loan approval. There have been no changes, Beatrice said. The house is exactly as it was when my father died. They have only moved the clocks. Matthew let out a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. All right. I will schedule Mr. Henderson for next Tuesday at 10. Once his report is filed, the underwriting usually takes about 5 business days. If everything is in order, we can have the lump sum of $1.2 million deposited into your new money market account by the following Friday. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward her. This is the authorization for the new account. I just need your signature here at the bottom. Beatrice took the silver pen Matthew offered. She leaned forward, the black leather of her handbag creaking slightly, and signed her name on the clean white paper. Beatrice Clara Vance. The ink was black, thick, and permanent. "Thank you, Miss Vance," Matthew said, taking the paper back. He stood up, offering his hand. "We'll be in touch on Monday to confirm the appraiser's arrival." Beatrice stood up and shook his hand. His palm was warm, dry, and brief. She turned and walked out of the office, her black leather handbag tucked securely under her arm. As she stepped back through the glass airlock doors, the cold, damp mist hit her face. It was precisely 2:15. Back at the house on Alder Street, she knew. Donald's friend Richard would be walking through her bedroom, his camera clicking, his tape measure zipping, taking photos of a master suite he believed would soon belong to a developer. Beatrice walked slowly, her orthotic shoes steady on the wet pavement. She was in no hurry to get back. The trap had been set, the contract was signed, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt a quiet, icy sense of peace. The sleek silver sedan, parked in the driveway of 412 Alder Street, did not belong to anyone in the family. It was clean, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the gray afternoon sky, and bore a small, magnetic parking permit from a prominent commercial real estate firm in its windshield. Beatrice stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the cold mist clinging to her eyelashes. She looked at the car, then up at the towering Victorian. From the outside, the house looked massive, dark, and slightly crooked, squeezed between the two concrete walls of the rising condominium complexes. But to Beatrice, it had always felt like a living thing, a slow-breathing entity that had sheltered her family for 3 generations. She walked up the porch steps. The front door opened with a familiar, heavy creak. As she stepped into the foyer, the smell of damp wool and wet leather hit her. A pair of pristine, expensive leather loafers lay neatly on the runner rug, next to Donald's mud-splattered brogues. Beatrice sat on the small wooden bench in the hallway to remove her wet walking shoes. She slipped her feet into her soft wool indoor slippers, her joints aching slightly from the cold walk. She hung her beige trench coat on its peg, carefully smoothing the fabric so it wouldn't wrinkle. Before she could step into the hallway, voices drifted from the parlor. "The footprint is incredible," a man's voice said, deep, professional, and entirely devoid of any sentimentality. "With the current setbacks, you could easily clear 40,000 square feet of buildable space if you demo the carriage house in the back. The developer I represent would pay top dollar for a clean lot on this block. We're talking $3 million minimum for a straight acquisition. And the title?" Donald's voice was hushed, carrying a nervous, vibrating energy. "You're sure the transfer won't be flagged because of her age? As long as she signs the deed transfer, or you have a fully executed durable power of attorney," the professional voice replied. "If you can get her to sign the POA this weekend, I can have the preliminary contract drafted by Tuesday. We can bypass her entirely in the final negotiations with the developer. It's cleaner that way. Less emotional friction. She's already showing signs." Clara's voice joined in, sounding thin and anxious. "She didn't make dinner last night, and she left Donald's suit untreated. She just walked out today, without saying where she was going. If we can get her doctor to sign off on a mild cognitive impairment, we won't even need her to understand what she's signing." Beatrice stood in the dim foyer. She looked down at her hands, resting flat against her thighs. Her fingers were steady. She did not feel the sudden rush of anger that would have exhausted her years ago. Instead, she performed a silent, cold calculation. It was Tuesday. The bank's official appraiser, Mr. Henderson, would arrive next Tuesday morning. The funds, $1.2 million, would be deposited into her private account by the following Friday, if she could keep the family quiet and unsuspecting for exactly 10 days. The house would be legally encumbered by a federal reverse mortgage. Any contract Donald signed with his developer would be completely worthless. The bank would hold a primary lien on the property, and the moment she died or moved out, The house would belong to Apex Trust, leaving Donald's family with nothing but a pile of empty promises and a mountain of legal debt. She took a deep, quiet breath. Beatrice stepped out of the foyer and into the parlor archway. The conversation died instantly. Donald, who had been leaning over the coffee table with a set of architectural blueprints, jumped slightly, his elbow catching his paper cup of coffee and spilling a dark, wet circle onto the table. Clara's hand flew to her collarbone, her eyes widening as she stared at Beatrice as if she had just seen a ghost. "Aunt Bea!" Donald stammered, his face turning a blotchy, uneven red. You're back. We didn't hear the door." Beside him stood a tall, thin man in his late 40s with sharp, wire-rimmed glasses and a tablet clutched under his arm. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and mints. "Miss Vance," the man said, offering a polite, practiced smile. "I'm Richard, the appraiser. Your nephew was just showing me some of the structural elements of the parlor." Beatrice looked at Richard. She saw the digital laser measure sitting on the mantelpiece, right next to the cheap eucalyptus reed diffuser Clara had placed there. The little red laser dot was still visible, a tiny, bleeding eye on the opposite wall. "Richard," Beatrice said softly, nodding her head, "I hope the house wasn't too drafty for you." "Not at all," Richard said, his tone overly gentle, the tone one might use with a very small child or a delicate piece of glass. "It's a remarkably solid house. Wonderful bones. You've kept it beautifully." "My grandfather built it," Beatrice said. "He believed that if you build a house with clean timber and deep foundations, it will last as long as the family needs it." Donald let out a dry, nervous chuckle, quickly stepping between Beatrice and the blueprints on the table. He folded the papers with a loud, frantic rustle. "Yes, exactly. Solid foundations," Donald said, his voice rising a bit too high. "That's exactly why Richard was here. We want to make sure the insurance policy reflects that. We don't want any surprises if something structural happens. We're just trying to protect your investment, Aunt Bea." "Thank you, Donald," Beatrice said. She looked directly into his eyes, her expression entirely serene. "It is very comforting to know how much you think about my future." Donald's smile faltered. His left eye twitched, a tiny rhythmic pulse of skin that seemed to betray his panic. He looked at Clara, who was still standing frozen by the sofa, her fingers white where she gripped her microfiber cloth. "Well," Richard said, clearing his throat and tucking his tablet into his leather case, "I've got everything I need for the report, Donald. I'll have the valuation drafted by Friday." "Great, great," Donald said, ushering Richard toward the foyer with a frantic, protective sweep of his arm. "I'll walk you out. Clara, why don't you help Aunt Bea with her coat?" "My coat is already hung up, Donald," Beatrice said. She walked past them, movements slow and deliberate. She picked up the laser measure from the mantelpiece. Richard had forgotten it in his haste to leave. She held the small, heavy plastic device in her hand, feeling the cold weight of it. "You forgot your tool, Richard," she said, holding it out to him. Richard turned, his face flushing slightly as he took the device from her hands. "Ah, yes. Thank you, Miss Vance. Can't do my job without it." "No," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a quiet, flat whisper that seemed to echo in the high-ceilinged room. "I suppose you can't." The front door opened, letting in a gust of cold, wet air, and then clicked shut. Beatrice stood in the parlor. Clara was still watching her from the corner of the room, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting to the dirty coffee table where the spilled coffee was slowly soaking into the wood of the table. Beatrice's mother had polished every Sunday. Beatrice did not wipe up the coffee. She did not look at Clara. She turned and began the slow climb back up the stairs to her bedroom, her hand guiding her up the mahogany rail, her mind counting the days, 10 days, 10 quiet, silent days, and the trap would be locked forever. The wind rose again at 9 o'clock. rattling the loose pane in the corner of Beatrice's bay window. Inside her room, she sat at her grandmother's mahogany dressing table, illuminated by the single warm bulb of her small brass lamp. She was performing a physical routine she had not done in years, sorting through her lacquer jewelry box. It was a dark, heavy Japanese box with a faded gold peony painted on the lid. Inside, the velvet lining smelled of dried rose petals, camphor, and old paper. With slow, deliberate movements, Beatrice lifted out her mother's silver locket, a small pair of pearl earrings she had worn to her high school graduation, and her grandfather's brass pocket watch. The watch was silent, its mainspring broken since 1974, but the heavy casing still held the warmth of her palm. She set these 3 items onto a small square of black velvet. She was not packing clothes. Clothes could be bought anywhere. She was sorting through the small, portable fragments of her history, the only things she would take with her when she walked out of this house for the last time. Overhead, the ceiling fan in her bedroom hummed, a low, rhythmic vibration. Beneath her feet, the black iron heating grate began to hiss as the old radiator in the kitchen below clanked to life. Beatrice quietly rose from her stool. She walked to the corner of the room, her movements practiced and silent, and knelt once more on the Persian rug. She leaned her head near the decorative iron scrollwork. She was just so pleasant when she came back. Clara's voice floated up, thin and tight with anxiety. It was creepy, Donald. She looked Richard right in the eye and told him she hoped the house wasn't too drafty. She didn't even care that we had moved the clock. She's probably just tired, Donald's voice replied, followed by the heavy, metallic clink of a spoon stirring a mug. Or she's realizing she can't fight us on this. If she's slipping, her defenses are going to go first. But we can't take any chances. If Richard's developer has the preliminary contract ready by Tuesday, we need to be ready to act immediately. Did you bring the papers? Clara asked. Yes. The durable power of attorney is in my briefcase. I'm going to take it up to her tonight. I'll bring her some of that chamomile tea she likes. I'll tell her it's just to help her with the winter utility bills, so she doesn't have to worry about the checkbook anymore. Do you think she'll sign it? She's 72, Donald said, his voice carrying the smooth, unearned confidence of a man who had never had to work for his own shelter. She's lived in this house her whole life. She's terrified of change. Once I show her how easy it is to let me handle the accounts, she'll sign. She trusts me. 72? Beatrice murmured to herself, her voice a tiny, silent exhalation in the dark room. Donald didn't even know her age. She was 62. He had added 10 years to her life in his own mind, simply because it made his plans feel more urgent, more justified. A floorboard creaked in the hallway downstairs, followed by the slow, hesitant tread of Donald climbing the main stairs. Beatrice stood up. She smoothed her charcoal skirt, checked her hair in the mirror, and walked to her bedroom door. She stood there, waiting in the dark. Tap, tap, tap. The knock was soft, performatively polite. Beatrice turned the key in the mortise lock. The heavy clack of the brass bolt sliding back made Donald take a half-step backward in the hallway. She opened the door exactly 4 inches. Donald was standing on the landing. He was holding a small wooden tray with a steaming porcelain mug of chamomile tea and a blue paper folder. He was smiling, that wide, empty, filial smile that Beatrice had once mistaken for affection. His lopsided tie was gone, and his shirt collar was unbuttoned, revealing his soft, pale neck. "Aunt Bea," Donald said, his voice dropping into a warm, soothing register. "I noticed you didn't have much of an appetite at dinner, and I know how much you love chamomile. I thought I'd bring you a cup to help you sleep. The wind is really howling tonight." Beatrice looked at the tray. The tea was pale, thin, and smelled faintly of copper. He had likely used hot water from the tap, rather than boiling it in the kettle. "Thank you, Donald," she said softly. She opened the door another 2 inches, just enough to take the tray from his hands. That is very thoughtful of you. Of course, Donald said, his smile widening. He tapped the blue folder resting on the tray next to the mug. And while I was downstairs, I remembered those insurance documents we talked about. Well, actually, it's just that power of attorney form I mentioned earlier, to help with the utilities and the property taxes. He leaned slightly closer, his eyes trying to peer past her shoulder into the dark bedroom. I thought, since you had to walk all the way to the bank today in that awful mist, it's too much for you, Aunt Bea. Really, if you sign this, I can handle all the administrative stuff directly. You won't have to worry about the checkbook or the utility bills ever again. We just want to take the burden off your shoulders. Beatrice looked down at the blue folder. In her mind, she performed the calculation. If she refused to take the folder, or if she told him she would never sign it, Donald would panic. He would consult Clara. They would realize she was fully aware of their plans, and they would move faster. They might try to contact a lawyer or force her into a medical evaluation before the bank's appraiser could arrive next Tuesday. She needed to buy exactly 7 days. She looked up at Donald, her expression softening into a look of quiet, weary gratitude. She let her shoulders stoop slightly, letting him see the ghost he believed she was. "You are so good to me, Donald," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to make his chest swell with self-satisfaction. "My eyes are so tired tonight from the walking, but I will put it on my desk. I'll get my reading glasses out tomorrow morning and look it over." Donald's shoulder muscles visibly relaxed. His left eye didn't twitch. "Of course, Aunt Bea. No rush at all. Well, maybe by Friday, just so we can get it notarized and off your mind before the weekend." "Yes," Beatrice said, her voice a gentle, yielding sigh. "Friday sounds wonderful. I'll have it ready for you." "Perfect," Donald said, taking another step back. "You get some sleep. Don't worry about a thing." "Good night, Donald," Beatrice said. She closed the door. She turned the key in the lock, the heavy brass bolt sliding back into place with a solid, satisfying clack. She walked to her desk. She set the tea tray down next to her lacquer jewelry box. She took the cup of lukewarm chamomile tea and poured it directly into her small ivy plant on the windowsill. The soil absorbed the pale liquid with a faint, bubbling hiss. Then she picked up the blue folder. She opened it, looking at the crisp, white pages of the durable power of attorney document. It was fully drafted, complete with her name typed in bold letters, waiting only for her signature and a notary's seal. Beatrice laid the blue folder flat on her desk. Then she reached into her bag, took out the cream-colored Apex Trust folder, and placed it directly on top of Donald's document. The two folders sat together under the warm glow of the brass lamp, the fake insurance papers and the real reverse mortgage contract, side by side in the dark. Beatrice sat down on her stool. She picked up her grandfather's silent brass pocket watch, feeling the cold weight of the metal in her palm, and watched the rain lash against the window. The Cold War had ended. The lines had been drawn, and Donald had just handed her the very shovel she would use to dig his financial grave. The dining room was the coldest room in the house on Wednesday morning. A draft from the floorboards below curled around Beatrice's ankles as she opened the glass-paneled corner cabinet. The cabinet was made of dark, heavy walnut. It's stiff with 70 years of accumulated varnish. Inside sat her grandmother's Haviland china, 36 pieces of delicate, translucent porcelain hand-painted with pale pink clover blossoms and thin, gold-leaf rims. It had not been used since the Thanksgiving before her mother died. Beatrice reached into the cabinet. Her physical routine was slow, precise, and rhythmic. She took out a teacup, holding it by its delicate, looped handle. She placed it in the center of a square of gray tissue paper she had saved from an old department store box. She folded the corners of the paper over the porcelain, tucked the edges neatly, and set the wrapped cup into the bottom of a sturdy cardboard apple crate she had retrieved from the basement. Crinkle, fold, tuck. The sound of the dry paper was loud in the quiet house. "Oh, Beatrice, what are you doing?" Clara stood in the dining room archway. She was holding a mug of coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore a soft, gray fleece pullover. Her eyes darted from the empty shelves of the walnut cabinet to the cardboard box at Beatrice's feet. A sudden, sharp look of calculation flared in Clara's eyes, quickly smoothed over by a mask of warm maternal concern. Are you packing up the china?" Clara asked, stepping into the room. She set her mug down on the dining table, her slippers whispering against the unpolished oak floorboards. "Sweetie, is everything okay? You don't have to do this all by yourself." "It's time they were packed," Beatrice said. She did not look up. She reached for a small, shallow saucer, centering it on a fresh sheet of tissue paper. Crinkle, fold, tuck. "Well, yes, absolutely," Clara said, her voice rising with a fluttering, eager excitement she tried desperately to suppress. She stepped closer, her hands hovering over the table, as if she wanted to grab the paper himself. "Honestly, it's incredibly smart of you to get a head start. Downsizing is, well, it's a process, isn't it? It's so much easier if you do it little by little, rather than waiting until the last minute." Clara believed with absolute certainty that Beatrice was preparing for her move to the assisted living suite near the park. She believed the silent old woman had finally surrendered, accepting her fate after Donald's conversation the night before. "I have a massive roll of bubble wrap in the garage from that shipment of patio cushions," Clara said, her eyes shining with greed as she looked at the antique china. "And some heavy-duty packing tape. Let me go get it. We want to make sure these don't chip. They're so delicate." "Thank you, Clara," Beatrice said softly. "That would be very helpful." While Clara hurried out to the garage, Beatrice stood alone in the cold dining room. She performed a silent, precise calculation. The Haviland china was worth approximately $1,200 to a reputable antique dealer downtown, the one located just 2 doors down from Apex Trust. She had already called them yesterday afternoon from a payphone near the bank. They had agreed to inspect the set on Friday. If Clara wrapped the entire 36-piece set in professional bubble wrap, Beatrice wouldn't have to spend a single penny on packing materials. And Clara, in her desperate eagerness to clear the house for the developers, would do all the tedious, physical labor of carrying the heavy crates down to the front porch. Beatrice watched as Clara returned, dragging a massive, static-cling roll of clear plastic bubble wrap and a heavy red tape dispenser. "Here we go," Clara said, her face slightly flushed as she began ripping the plastic with her manicured fingernails. "Let me do the dinner plates. They're the heaviest. We should pack them on their edges, you know. My mother always said they're less likely to crack that way." "Your mother was a very practical woman," Beatrice murmured. "She was," Clara said, her tape dispenser letting out a sharp, tearing shriek. "Screech snap. She always said, Clara, don't let old things hold you back from new opportunities." And she was right. Change is hard, Beatrice, but it's always for the best. You'll see. Beatrice took a wrapped saucer and placed it gently in the box. "Donald was so relieved this morning," Clara continued, her voice casual, her eyes fixed on the plate she was wrapping. "He said you were so sweet about the utility papers last night. He really wants to help you get everything organized, Beatrice. He was saying we should probably go down to the notary on Friday afternoon just to get that power of attorney finalized. That way, we can take care of the heavy lifting for you before the cold weather really sets in." "Friday afternoon," Beatrice repeated, her tone flat, unreadable. "Yes," Clara said, not looking at Beatrice as she taped the edges of the plastic bubble wrap. "Screech snap. We can make an afternoon of it. Maybe go to that nice little bistro by the courthouse for lunch. Our treat, of course. It'll be a nice little celebration. A celebration, Beatrice said. Just a little way of saying thank you, Clara said, her voice dropping into a sweet, patronizing register, for trusting us, for letting us help you take care of things. Beatrice reached for the next teacup. She felt the cool, smooth porcelain against her dry fingertips. She thought of the notary appointment on Friday. She thought of the Apex Trust deposit that would land in her private account the following week. She thought of the look that would be on Donald's face when he realized his power of attorney was completely useless against a federally insured reverse mortgage that had already been executed by the sole owner of the deed. I will be ready on Friday, Beatrice said. Perfect, Clara said, her face glowing with a quiet, triumphant satisfaction as she sealed the box with another loud, daring strip of plastic tape. Screech snap. I'll let Donald know. He'll be so pleased. The smell of the plastic tape, hot adhesive, and old dust filled the cold dining room. Beatrice kept her head down, her hands moving with silent, rhythmic precision, letting her sister-in-law pack away her family's inheritance, one gold-rimmed plate at a time. The concrete floor of safekeep storage was the color of a wet slate shingle. Beatrice stood in the center of the narrow corridor. On the ground floor, her black leather handbag gripped in both hands. The air in the hallway was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of galvanized steel, motor oil, and the dry, chalky odor of old drywall. Above her head, a long fluorescent tube flickered with a faint, high-pitched hum that vibrated in the back of her ears. This is Unit 104, the clerk said. Her name was Brenda. She was a tired-looking woman in her late 50s with faded red hair held up by a plastic claw clip and a blue company lanyard jingling against her chest. She gripped the heavy steel latch of the rolling metal door, pulled the pin, and shoved the door upward. Clang, clatter, clack. The metal door rolled into the ceiling, revealing a 5-by-5-foot concrete box. The walls were corrugated steel, empty and sterile, lit only by the gray light filtering in from the hallway. It's ground floor, climate-controlled, just like you wanted, Brenda said, leaning against the door frame. She took a drag from an unlit vape pen, her eyes scanning Beatrice's neat charcoal skirt and trench coat. No stairs, and the loading dock is just 30 feet down the hall. Easy in, easy out. Beatrice stepped inside the tiny room. She paced 3 steps forward, her shoes tapping softly against the gray concrete, until her knuckles brushed the back wall. It was small, but to Beatrice, it felt larger than the entire 3-story Victorian on Alder Street. Here, there was no draft from the basement. There was no smell of Clara's synthetic lavender or Donald's stale coffee. There was no sound of floorboards groaning under the feet of people who were counting the days until she died. This 5-by-5-foot concrete box was the only space in the world that belonged entirely to her, and no one else in her family knew it existed. It will do perfectly, Beatrice said. All right, Brenda said, stepping back into the corridor. Let's go back to the office and finish up the paperwork. I'll need your ID and a primary mailing address. They walked back down the echoing hallway, Brenda's heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the concrete. The office smelled of stale tobacco and a cheap electric heater plug-in. Beatrice sat in a vinyl chair opposite cluttered desk, her eyes resting on a faded calendar from 3 years ago tacked to the wall. Name? Brenda asked, her fingers hovering over a yellowed keyboard. Beatrice Vance. Mailing address? Post Office Box 702, Downtown Station, Beatrice said. She had quietly opened the box the previous afternoon after leaving Apex Trust. She wanted no mail from Safekeep Storage or the bank to ever cross the threshold of Alder Street. Brenda's fingers tapped the keys. Clack, clack, clack. Okay, Brenda said, squinting at her monitor. The rate is $85 a month. We require a one-time $15 administration fee, and you have to provide your own padlock. If you don't have one, we sell them here for $12. I brought my own, Beatrice said. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a heavy brass padlock she had found in her father's old workbench in the carriage house. It was a sturdy, commercial-grade lock with 2 heavy brass keys. "Perfect," Brenda said. "Now how would you like to pay? Credit card?" "Cash," Beatrice said. She opened her leather purse and laid 3 crisp green $50 bills onto the desk. She had withdrawn the money from her small savings account that morning, leaving exactly $42 in her old checking account. Brenda picked up the bills, checking them against the light with a practiced, indifferent flick of her wrist. She slid them into her drawer and printed a small, white receipt. "Sign here," Brenda said, pointing to the bottom of a pink carbon slip. Beatrice signed her name, Beatrice Clara Vance. "Here's your copy of the lease and the gate access code," Brenda said, sliding a laminated card and the receipt across the desk. "Code is *412*. Don't lose it. If you forget it, we charge $10 to reset it." "I won't forget it," Beatrice said. The numbers were her father's old street address from before they moved to Alder Street. She tucked the papers and the brass keys into her handbag, zipped it shut, and stood up. "Have a good afternoon," Brenda said, already looking down at her phone. Beatrice stepped out of the office and back into the cold afternoon. The mist had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle that slicked the asphalt of the storage facility's parking lot. She pulled her umbrella open with a sharp black snap, holding it low over her head as she walked toward the downtown district. She performed a silent, precise calculation. It was Wednesday. Tomorrow, she would begin the quiet migration of her possessions. She would pack 3 cardboard boxes of her grandmother's silver, her mother's vanity sets, and her own small library of leather-bound books. On Friday afternoon, while Donald and Clara were at the courthouse notary and the girls were out, she would hire a young man with a small pickup truck, the grandson of her old neighbor, to load the apple crates of Haviland china and her boxes from the front porch. She would pay him $50 in cash. By the time Donald and Clara returned from their celebration lunch with the signed power of attorney in their pockets, the dining room cabinet would be completely empty. The family heirlooms would be locked behind the heavy brass padlock in Unit 104, entirely secure, while the family believed she was simply clearing clutter for their developer. Beatrice turned the corner of Elm Street, her boots splashing through a small gray puddle. Through the damp fog, she could see the green awning of the local antique shop. She did not feel tired. She did not feel the ache in her knees. She felt only the cold, steady ticking of her grandfather's watch in her pocket. A pocket watch that didn't need to run to tell her that time was finally on her side. The pink Wright's silver cream had a sharp, ammonia-heavy scent that caught in the back of Beatrice's throat, a chemical sting that smelled of cold, damp pantries and long-forgotten holidays. She sat at the dining room table, a worn flannel rag wrapped tightly around her index finger. In front of her lay the mahogany velvet-lined drawer she had pulled from the heavy walnut sideboard. Inside, nested in custom-cut slots of tarnish-resistant green felt, was her mother's sterling silver flatware, 72 pieces of heavy Grand Baroque patterned silver. Scrape, rub, circular motion. With each pass of her finger, the greasy black oxidation on a dinner fork dissolved, transferring onto the white flannel as a dark, oily smudge. Beneath the black crust, the intricate, swirling grapevines and floral clusters of the silver pattern emerged, catching the dim afternoon light like polished ice. This was her physical routine. It required no thoughts, only the steady, rhythmic pressure of her thumb. "Oh, wow. I forgot we even had those." Maeve walked into the dining room, her sneakers dragging on the rug. She was wearing her oversized college sweatshirt, her wireless headphones draped like a plastic collar around her neck. In her right hand, she held a crisp green apple. She took a bite, the sound a loud, wet crunch that shattered the quiet of the room. She leaned against the edge of the table, her shadow falling across Beatrice's workspace. She didn't offer to help. Her eyes, ringed with heavy dark eyeliner, watched the dark smudge of tarnish on Beatrice's rag. "Is that actually real silver?" Maeve asked, her mouth full of apple. "Yes," Beatrice said, her voice remaining low, rhythmic with her polishing. "It's solid sterling silver. My father gave it to my mother for their 25th anniversary." "Is it worth a lot?" Maeve tilted her head, her gaze drifting over the neatly polished forks she had ignored for her entire life. "Chloe and I were looking at some design blogs yesterday. They say the vintage boho look is really in now. I think these would look so cool on a dark concrete table in my new apartment. You know, when we get the condo project finished." She reached out, her fingers, sticky with apple juice, hovering over a freshly polished butter knife. "Don't touch it," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it held a flat, quiet weight that made Maeve's hand freeze in midair. "The oil from your fingers will tarnish the metal." Maeve pulled her hand back, her lip curling into a slight defensive pout. "Geez, Aunt B, I was just looking. It's not like they're museum pieces." "They have a very high value," Beatrice said, continuing to rub the tines of a fork with the flannel rag. "Especially to the right collector. The weight alone is substantial." "Well, obviously," Maeve said, recovering her easy, casual confidence. She took another loud bite of her apple. "That's why I'm saying we should keep them. I'll tell Mom not to let the estate planners sell them off. It's like family history, right? It would be a waste to just let them sit in a drawer." Beatrice did not look up. She performed a silent, cold calculation. The Grand Baroque flatware set weighed roughly 80 troy ounces of sterling. At current market prices, the scrap silver value alone was significant, but as a complete, undamaged antique set, it was worth at least $2,500. The antique dealer on Elm Street had been very specific on the phone. "If it's polished and in the original velvet drawer, I can pay you cash on the spot on Friday." Maeve stood there, her eyes already drifting back to her phone screen as she scrolled through a social media feed. She believed, with the effortless entitlement of her youth, that this silver was her birthright, a stylish accessory for a future concrete table she would buy with the proceeds of her aunt's eviction. She had no idea that Beatrice was literally scrubbing the metal to make it look pristine for the dealer who would carry it away in less than 48 hours. "Oh, by the way," Maeve said, her thumb flicking rapidly across her screen. "Mom said we're ordering Thai food tonight. She's too tired to cook after all that packing she did this morning. She's getting you the chicken pad Thai."
"That's what you always get, right?"
"Yes," Beatrice said. "That is fine."
"Cool."
"It should be here around 6:30, Maeve said, turning toward the hallway, her headphones already sliding back over her ears. "Don't forget to wash your hands before you eat. That silver polished stuff smells like poison." Her sneakers squeaked on the parquet floor as she walked away, her head tilted down toward her screen. Beatrice sat in the quiet dining room. The sharp smell of the ammonia cream seemed to grow stronger, filling the corners of the dark walnut cabinets. She picked up a soup spoon, dipping her flannel rag back into the pink jar. Scrape, rub, circular motion. She felt the cold, heavy weight of the sterling in her hand. It was the weight of 30 years of her mother's care, 30 years of her own preservation. Tomorrow, she would finish the polishing. On Friday, the drawer would go into the cardboard box alongside the Haviland china. And when Donald, Clara, and the girls sat down to their takeout containers, next week, they would find the sideboard drawers completely empty, the velvet linings bare, and the family history they had so casually plotted to sell already converted into cold, untraceable cash in Beatrice's black leather handbag. The kitchen was warm with the heavy sweet and sour steam of cheap peanut oil, tamarind, and scorched garlic. The white plastic bags from Siam Gardens sat in the middle of the kitchen island, leaking a small pool of warm condensation onto the laminate. Donald, Clara, and the girls had already carried their cardboard containers into the parlor, their voices competing with the high-pitched laugh track of a sitcom blaring from the television. Donald walked back into the kitchen, his tie completely removed now, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He picked up a ceramic plate from the drying rack, one of the few Beatrice had, washed earlier, and carefully emptied a container of chicken pad thai onto it. He used a metal fork to slide the stuck noodles around, trying to make the presentation look deliberate. "Here you go, Aunt Bea," Donald said, turning to her with his practiced, gentle smile. He handed her the plate, along with a paper napkin. "I know how much you hate eating out of those plastic boxes. I figured you'd prefer a real plate." "Thank you, Donald," Beatrice said. She took the warm plate. "Oh, and don't forget," Donald said, leaning against the counter, his eyes darting briefly to her canvas handbag, sitting on the pantry chair before returning to her face. "Friday at 1:30. I called the notary office on 4th Street today and booked the appointment. It's all confirmed. Clara made a reservation at the bistro for 2:15, so we can have a nice quiet lunch afterward. You just need to bring your state ID and that blue folder I gave you last night." Beatrice looked down at the noodles on her plate. A single, crushed peanut was wedged between 2 bean sprouts. 1:30, she said. "Exactly," Donald said, patting her shoulder. "I took the whole afternoon off from the office. I wanted to make sure we didn't have to rush you. We'll take my car, so you don't have to worry about the walk. It's going to be so nice to finally get this off your plate, Aunt Bea. Really, you've carried the weight of this house for far too long." "You are very protective, Donald," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into that flat, soft register that always disarmed him. "Well, your family," Donald said, his chest puffing out slightly beneath his shirt. "It's what we do. Anyway, enjoy your dinner. Let me know if you need any more water." He turned and walked back to the parlor, his slippers scuffing against the floorboards. Beatrice did not eat in the kitchen. She carried her plate up the dark stairs, stepping carefully on the outer left edge of the 5th tread. She unlocked her bedroom door, stepped inside, and locked it behind her. She set the plate on her writing desk next to the 2 folders, the blue one and the cream-colored one. She ate slowly, her physical routine of chewing and swallowing silent in the quiet room. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the dampness of the night seemed to press against the window panes, making the glass cold to the touch. Once she had finished, she wiped the plate clean with a paper napkin, setting it aside. Then she walked to her closet. At the very back of the deep closet, beneath a row of old winter coats, sat 3 vintage leather suitcases. They were heavy, made of thick brown cowhide with brass buckles that had turned green with tarnish. Her father had bought them for their trip to Niagara Falls in 1968. Beatrice dragged the smallest of the 3 suitcases out into the light of her bedside lamp. She set it on her bed and unbuckled the straps. The interior of the suitcase was lined with faded blue silk, smelling of mothballs, lavender, and old paper. With slow, deliberate movements, she began to pack. She did not pack her heavy winter coats or the everyday house dresses she wore while scrubbing floors. She packed 4 of her best cotton nightgowns, her silver-backed hairbrush set, her writing paper, and 3 framed black and white photographs of her parents that had sat on her dresser for 30 years. She folded each garment with absolute precision, pressing the air out of the fabric with the palm of her hand before laying it in the blue silk lining. As she worked, she performed a silent, cold calculation. Donald believed that by securing her signature on the power of attorney on Friday afternoon, he would gain the legal authority to sign the deed of the house over to his developer on Tuesday. He believed he was locking her into a corner, but a power of attorney only allowed him to act as her agent. It did not strip her of her own ownership. and it did not erase the title search. When the bank's official appraiser, Mr. Henderson, arrived next Tuesday at 10 o'clock, he would document the house for the reverse mortgage. By the following Friday, the bank would execute the Heckham contract, depositing $1.2 million of tax-free cash directly into Beatrice's private money market account. And the moment that contract was recorded at the county office, Apex Trust would place a primary, non-negotiable lien of $1.2 million on the title of 412 Alder Street if Donald tried to sell the house to his developer on Tuesday or Wednesday. Using his new power of attorney, the developer's title insurance company would immediately flag the bank's primary lien. Any buyer would have to pay off the bank's $2 million debt before they could acquire the property. The developer would realize the clean lot was saddled with a massive, federally backed mortgage, and they would pull their $3 million offer instantly.
Donald would be left holding a signed piece of paper that gave him power over an estate
that had already been hollowed out from the inside. He would have the house. He would have the leaking roof. He would have the rotting gutters and the utility bills. But the equity, the gold mine he had spent 7 years waiting to inherit, would be sitting safely in Beatrice's private bank account, entirely out of his reach. Beatrice tucked the silver hairbrush into the corner of the suitcase. Downstairs, the television sitcom ended, replaced by the loud, dramatic music of the local evening news. She heard Chloe laughing in the hallway, the sound bright, sharp, and completely empty. Beatrice closed the lid of the leather suitcase. She drew the brass buckles tight, the metal clicking into place with a small, sharp snap. She slid the suitcase back into the deep shadow of her closet, hidden behind her long winter coats. The trap was fully designed, the timeline was locked, and Donald's eager, helpful lunch on Friday was the exact key she needed to turn the bolt. The yellow flannel cloth was damp with Old English lemon oil, its scent heavy, sweet, and medicinal in the chilly dining room. Beatrice stood before the open walnut corner cabinet, her physical routine slow and rhythmic as she wiped the dark, dusty wood of the empty shelves. Where the Haviland china had sat for decades, there were clean, pale circles on the timber, ghostly footprints of the plates and cups Clara had sealed in bubble wrap the day before. Beatrice worked the oiled cloth in circular motions, watching the pale circles darken and vanish, blending back into the uniform glossy dark of the walnut. Rub, polish, smooth. The wood groaned slightly under the pressure of her hand, a familiar, low creak that she had heard every spring of her life. Beatrice, why on earth are you cleaning the inside of the cabinet? Clara stood in the dining room, her car keys jingling in her hand. She was dressed in her cream-colored wool coat, her sunglasses already perched on top of her highlighted hair. She looked at the yellow cloth in Beatrice's hand, then at the empty, dark shelves of the cabinet, her brow furrowing with a mixture of amusement and pity. "Sweetie, we just packed all of that away yesterday," Clara said, taking a step closer. The cloying scent of her expensive floral perfume clashed with the sharp, clean aroma of the lemon oil. "You don't need to dust the empty shelves. When the time comes, we'll have a professional deep clean crew handle the whole house anyway. You should be resting. Save your knees for tomorrow." "A house should be clean when you leave it," Beatrice said. She did not look at Clara. She continued to rub the cloth along the back corner of the shelf, where a thick web of gray dust had gathered near the hinge. Clara let out a soft, patronizing sigh, her face softening into that triumphant, self-satisfied look she wore whenever she believed Beatrice was acting out of senile habit. "Well, yes, of course," Clara said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "It's very sweet of you to want to keep things nice, but really, don't overdo it. Oh, by the way, Donald is so excited about tomorrow. He's already got the notary papers in his leather portfolio. He was saying how much of a relief it's going to be for you." "Yes," Beatrice said. her voice a low, yielding murmur. "Friday is a very important day." "It is," Clara said, her eyes shining with greed as she looked around the spacious dining room, already visualizing the modern, open-concept layout her developer friend had sketched out. "It's the start of a whole new chapter for everyone." "Oh, I should run. I've got to pick up some things for the girls." "Clara, what did you say your schedule was for tomorrow morning? I want to make sure I don't get in your way." Clara laughed, a light, dismissive sound. "In my way? Beatrice, sweetie, you're never in my way. But if you're worried about the driveway, Donald is leaving for his regional board follow-up meeting at exactly 8 o'clock. He won't be back until noon, and I have my hair appointment downtown at 10, so I'll be leaving the house by 9:45 to make sure I can find parking." She stepped closer, her brass key ring jingling again. "The girls actually have a brunch with their college friends at 10:30, so they'll be out of the house by 10:15. You'll have the whole place to yourself tomorrow morning."
It'll be nice and quiet for you to get ready before Donald and I come back to pick you up.
"For the notary at 1:30. Beatrice stopped her hand. She held the yellow cloth against the dark walnut shelf, her fingers feeling the cold grain of the wood. She performed a silent, precise calculation. Donald leaves at 8 a.m. Clara leaves at 9:45 a.m. Chloe and Maeve leave at 10:15 a.m. The house would be completely empty by 10:15. Toby, the neighbor's grandson who owned the small black pickup truck, was scheduled to arrive at the back kitchen door at exactly 10:30. Mr. Sterling, the antique dealer from Elm Street, was scheduled for 10:45. They would have exactly 45 minutes. Toby would load the heavy cardboard boxes of bubble-wrapped Haviland china, the mahogany drawer of sterling silver flatware, and Beatrice's 3 vintage leather suitcases from the pantry. Mr. Sterling would inspect the silver and the china on the spot, write her a certified cashier's check or hand her the cash, and help Toby load the boxes into the truck. By 11:30, Toby would drive the items to Safekeep's storage, where Beatrice would lock them securely inside Unit 14 behind her father's heavy brass padlock. She would walk back to Alder Street by 12:30, her black leather handbag loaded with cash, leaving the dining room and her bedroom completely stripped of every physical asset her family had plotted to inherit. And at 1:30, when Donald and Clara arrived to take her to the notary, she would be sitting quietly in the parlor, dressed in her charcoal skirt, her face a calm, compliant mask, ready to sign a power of attorney that would give Donald control over an empty shell. "Perfect," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the old Kenmore refrigerator in the kitchen. "What was that, sweetie?" Clara asked, adjusting her sunglasses on her head. "I said that sounds perfect," Beatrice said. She turned to Clara, her expression entirely serene, her eyes unblinking. "I will make sure the driveway is completely clear for you by 10. "You are so thoughtful, Beatrice," Clara said, reaching out to pat Beatrice's arm, a brief, patronizing touch that felt as empty as her words. "I don't know what we'd do without you. I'll see you tonight for dinner." The heavy mahogany front door clicked open, letting in a brief gust of cold, wet wind, and then slammed shut. Beatrice stood alone in the dark dining room. She looked down at the yellow flannel cloth in her hand, now black with 70 years of hidden dust. She looked at the walnut cabinet, its interior shelves now dark, uniform, and smelling heavily of lemon oil. She did not dust the dining table. She did not wipe down the sideboard. She carried the yellow rag down to the basement, tossed it into the trash bin, and began the slow climb back up to her bedroom, her mind locked on the ticking of the clock downstairs. The preparation was complete, the timeline was verified, and the quiet, silent storm was finally ready to break. The splash of cold tap water on Beatrice's face was sharp, shocking her skin into a tight, icy clarity. She stood before the small sink in her bedroom's private washroom, her hands gripping the edges of the white porcelain basin. The faucet vibrated slightly, letting out a low, metallic hum as the water trickled down the drain. She used a rough white hand towel to pat her skin dry, her movements slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. It was Friday morning, 7:45. She dressed in her charcoal wool skirt and her cream-colored blouse, the fabric stiff and clean against her skin. She combed her gray hair back into its tight, neat bun, securing it with 3 heavy steel hairpins. She did not look like a woman who was preparing to dismantle a family's future. She looked, as she always had, like the quiet, invisible aunt who lived in the background of their lives. Tap, tap. The knock on her door was brisk, carrying the hurried, frantic energy of Donald's morning routine. Beatrice unlocked the door, opening it exactly 4 inches. Donald stood on the landing, his leather portfolio clutched under his arm. He was dressed in his best gray suit, the one Beatrice had taken to the cleaners after all, though she had not treated the grease spot, which still sat like a dark, faint shadow on his lapel. His silk tie was perfectly knotted, and his thinning hair was slicked back with wet gel. "Aunt Bea, I'm heading out to the meeting," Donald said, his voice loud and bright with a nervous, vibrating excitement. He tapped the leather portfolio with his fingers. "Everything is set for 1:30. Clara will be back to pick you up at 1:15, and I'll meet you both at the notary's office. You've got the blue folder, right?" "Yes," Beatrice said softly. "I have it. Terrific. We're going to get this all sorted today, Aunt Bea. It's going to be a great day. I'll see you this afternoon." "Have a productive meeting, Donald," Beatrice said. She closed the door and turned the key. The heavy brass bolt clicked into place. From her window, she watched as Donald's sedan backed out of the driveway, its exhaust plumes white and thick in the damp, freezing morning air. By 8:30, the second phase of the morning exodus began. The upstairs hallway smelled of scorching hair, synthetic coconut hairspray, and the sharp, chemical heat of Clara's flat iron. Clara's bathroom door was wide open, and the sound of her voice carried clearly through the thin plaster wall of Beatrice's bedroom. She was on her Bluetooth earpiece, her slippers pacing the floorboards with a rapid, rhythmic scuff, scuff, scuff. "No, we're finalizing the POA today at 1:30, Clara said, her voice dripping with a sharp, triumphant satisfaction. "Donald's developer friend already has the preliminary contract ready. He's submitting it Tuesday morning. We're looking at a $3 million payout. Minimum." A pause, followed by the clatter of a makeup brush against the counter. "Of course we're moving her," Clara continued, her tone turning cold, administrative, and entirely dismissive. "Donald found this facility, Sunnyvale, over by the park. They have a shared room wing that's actually very reasonable. We're going to opt for that. It's about $5,000 a month cheaper than the private suites." Another pause. Clara let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Honestly, she's so quiet and out of it, she won't even notice the difference. Why waste $60,000 a year on a private room for her when we can put that money toward the girls' down payments on those new townhouses downtown? It's just practical, sister. She doesn't have any friends. She doesn't go anywhere. She'll be perfectly fine sharing a room with some other quiet old lady. It's for her own good anyway. She can't manage this house." Beatrice sat at her writing desk, her hands folded over her black leather handbag. She did not flinch. She did not feel the sudden hot sting of tears. Instead, she performed a silent, cold calculation. The shared room wing at Sunnyvale, a narrow bed, a plastic privacy curtain, and a shared dresser for her few cotton nightgowns. That was the value they had placed on her 30 years of service to this house, on her 7 years of paying their utility bills and washing their dirty dishes. She looked at her private money market account document from Apex Trust, tucked inside her handbag. $1.2 million. She thought of the luxury European river cruises. She had spent the last 3 nights researching on her old library computer the private suites with private balconies overlooking the Danube, the five-star hotels in Vienna where she would sip coffee and eat sashatorta, while Donald was trying to figure out how to pay the massive property tax bill on a house he could not sell. 60,000 a year, Beatrice whispered to herself. She would spend 60,000 a year on champagne and opera tickets, and she would do it with their inheritance. At 9:45, the heavy front door clicked open and slammed shut. Outside, the distinct dual beep-beep of Clara's SUV locking echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Clara was gone. At 10:15, the giggling voices of Chloe and Maeve drifted up from the foyer. They were arguing over who got to drive the smaller car, their light, empty laughter bouncing off the high ceilings before the front door slammed once more. The house fell into an absolute suffocating silence. Without the Victorian bronze clock on the parlor mantelpiece, there was no ticking. The silence was heavy, thick with 70 years of dust and the faint smell of Clara's coconut hairspray. Beatrice stood up. She picked up her black handbag and walked down the dark stairs, stepping precisely on the outer left edge of the fifth tread. She walked through the dining room, past the empty walnut cabinet, and into the kitchen. Tap, tap. The knock at the back kitchen door was soft, hesitant, and precise. Beatrice opened the door. Toby, the neighbor's 20-year-old grandson, stood on the back porch. He was wearing a heavy flannel jacket and work boots, and behind him in the narrow alleyway sat his small black pickup truck, its engine idling with a low rhythmic rattle. "Morning, Miss Vance," Toby said, pulling off his knit cap. "I've got the truck ready, just like you asked. Where are the boxes?" "They are in the pantry, Toby," Beatrice said, her voice calm, steady, and entirely clear. "There are 4 heavy cardboard boxes of china, 1 velvet-lined silver drawer, and 3 leather suitcases. We have exactly 45 minutes. "Yes, ma'am," Toby said, stepping into the warm kitchen. "Let's get to work." Beatrice stood by the kitchen counter, her eyes fixed on the empty driveway. The timeline was locked, the house was empty, and the final extraction of her life's work was finally underway. The cardboard flaps of the first apple crate scraped against the doorframe as Toby carried it out to the back porch. Thump, thump, thump. His heavy work boots vibrated through the kitchen floorboards, a rhythmic, hollow sound that marked the steady evacuation of Beatrice's heritage. Beatrice stood by the kitchen island, her black leather handbag resting on her arm, watching him through the window. Under the dark gray morning sky, the black pickup truck sat idling in the narrow gravel alleyway, its exhaust pipe puffing thin, white clouds of carbon that smelled of raw gasoline and wet dirt. Precisely at 10:45, a second vehicle pulled into the alleyway. It was a faded beige station wagon, its rear window covered in a dusty layer of road salt. An elderly man in a brown tweed coat and a flat wool cap stepped out. This was Mr. Sterling, the owner of the antique shop on Elm Street. He walked up the back steps with a slow, careful gait, his leather-gloved hands tucked into his pockets against the damp chill. "Morning, Miss Vance," Mr. Sterling said, pulling off his flat cap as Beatrice opened the back door. He had a soft, gravelly voice and wore thick, wire-rimmed spectacles that made his eyes look remarkably large and watery. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," he said, stepping into the kitchen. He looked around the quiet, high-ceilinged room, his eyes lingering on the empty cabinets. "Let's have a look at the goods, shall we?" Toby had set the cardboard boxes of bubble-wrapped Haviland china on the kitchen island. Beatrice reached into the first box, her wool-socked feet silent as she moved, and pulled out a single dinner plate. She peeled back Clara's neat layers of plastic bubble wrap and handed the porcelain to Mr. Sterling. The antique dealer held the plate up to the gray light of the window. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the pale green maker's mark on the underside of the glaze. "Haviland Limoges," he murmured, his watery eyes squinting through his spectacles. The clover blossom pattern. No chips, no crazing in the glaze, and the gold leaf on the rim is fully intact. It's an immaculate set, Miss Vance, truly. Most of these sets have been battered by dishwasher cycles or careless handling. It was only washed by hand, Beatrice said, with warm water and mild soap. Next, Mr. Sterling opened the mahogany velvet-lined drawer containing the sterling silver flatware. He picked up a dinner fork, holding the heavy Baroque handle to his eye to inspect the hallmark. He rubbed his thumb over the clean, polished tines, his face impassive. 72 pieces of Grand Baroque, he said, setting the fork back into its custom slot with a soft metallic chink. The weight is exactly what you quoted on the phone, and the polish is beautiful. You've taken extraordinary care of this. It was my mother's, Beatrice said. Mr. Sterling closed the drawer. He reached into his tweed coat pocket and pulled out a thick black leather wallet. He unzipped the inner compartment, his fingers, thick and dry, counting out a stack of crisp green bills. He laid them onto the kitchen island, right next to the empty plastic yogurt container Clara had left behind. $3,500 as agreed, Mr. Sterling said, his voice flat and professional. I've deducted $50 for my appraisal fee, but since the condition is so pristine, I'm happy to cover the difference. Beatrice looked at the stack of bills, $3,500 bills. They were clean, stiff, and smelled of dry paper and ink. She picked up the money. Her hands did not tremble. She slipped the bills into her black leather handbag, tucking them beneath her private money market folder. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, Beatrice said. My pleasure, Miss Vance, he said, turning to Toby, who was standing by the door. All right, son. Let's get these loaded into the wagon. Be very careful with the china box. Keep it upright. Beatrice watched from the kitchen window as the two men carried the boxes out to the alleyway. Toby secured the crates in the back of Mr. Sterling's station wagon, wrapping a thick blue moving blanket around them. Before Mr. Sterling closed the hatch, the beige car backed slowly down the narrow gravel alley, its red taillights disappearing into the thick, low mist of Elm Street. All right, Miss Vance, Toby said, stepping back into the kitchen, his face slightly flushed from the cold. That's the big stuff. I've got your 3 leather suitcases in the back of my truck under the tarp. We ready to go to the storage place? Yes, Toby, Beatrice said. She grabbed her beige trench coat from its peg in the hallway, buttoning it up to her throat. She locked the kitchen door, slipping the brass key into her handbag, and walked down the back steps. The ride to Safekeep Storage was short and silent. Toby's truck cabin smelled of pine tree air freshener, dry sawdust, and old upholstery. Beatrice stared out the passenger window, watching the modern, sterile glass condos glide past through the gray drizzle. At the storage facility, Toby helped her carry the 3 heavy cowhide suitcases down the cool concrete hallway of the ground floor. They set them inside Unit 104, lining them up neatly against the corrugated steel wall. The empty 5x5 space now held her entire life's possessions: the china, the silver, and her suitcases, leaving her father's house completely hollowed of her presence. Beatrice stepped out into the corridor. She took her father's heavy brass padlock from her handbag, slid the shackle through the steel latch of the rolling door, and snapped it shut. Click. The lock was heavy, solid, and cold in her gloved hand. Thanks, Toby, Beatrice said, handing him a $50 bill from her purse. Anytime, Miss Vance, the boy said, pocketing the money and adjusting his cap. You need a ride back? Yes, please, Beatrice said. Just drop me at the corner of Alder Street. I'd like to walk the last block. At precisely 11:30, Toby's truck pulled away from the curb at the corner of Elm and Alder. Beatrice stood on the sidewalk, the cold drizzle misting her face. She walked slowly toward the towering Victorian house. The yellow crane next door was silent now, the workers taking their lunch break, leaving the alleyway quiet and damp. She walked up the front steps and opened the heavy mahogany door. Inside, the house felt cold, drafty, and strangely light. The empty dining room cabinet was dark, its interior shelves glossy with the fresh lemon oil. The sideboard drawers were bare. Her bedroom closet was stripped of her suits and her mother's silver locket. Superficially, everything looked exactly the same. The heavy oak tables, the sofas, and the dusty rugs remained in their places. But the heart of the house, the physical record of her family's history, was gone. Beatrice sat in the parlor on the edge of the velvet armchair, her black leather handbag resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on the empty spot on the mantelpiece where the bronze clock had ticked for 70 years. She had exactly 2 hours before Donald and Clara would arrive to take her to the notary. And for the first time in her life, she felt absolutely nothing but a cold, quiet expectation. The air in the stairwell leading to the second-floor office on 4th Street was cold and smelled of damp radiator steam, yellowed newspaper, and the faint, sweet trace of cheap pipe tobacco. Clara walked a half step behind Beatrice, her hand lightly resting on Beatrice's elbow, a gesture that felt less like support and more like an escort guiding a prisoner to a cell. Her nails, fresh from her 10 o'clock beauty appointment, were a glossy, pristine pink that caught the dim light of the stairwell window. At the top of the landing, the frosted glass door read, Walter J. Davis, Notary Public and Commissioner of Deeds. Donald was already waiting inside the small reception room. He stood by the window, his gray suit jacket unbuttoned, his leather portfolio clutched in both hands. When the door clicked open and he saw Beatrice, his eyes flared with a sharp, triumphant light. He quickly stepped forward, his face twisting into that wide, warm smile he had worn all week. "Aunt Bea, you made it," Donald said, his voice dropping into a soft, soothing register. He took her handbag, setting it carefully on the vinyl chair by the wall. "Mr. Davis is just finishing up some paperwork, but he's ready for us. How was the drive down?" "The traffic was light," Beatrice said. "Perfect," Donald said, patting her shoulder. "Perfect. I'm so glad we could get this done today. Really, it's going to make everything so much simpler for you." The inner office door opened, and Mr. Davis stepped out. He was a short, thick-necked man in his late 60s, with thin gray hair combed flat across his scalp and heavy gold-rimmed bifocals resting on his nose. He smelled of cold tea and paper dust. "Donald," Mr. Davis said, nodding briefly before his eyes shifted to Beatrice. "Miss Vance, please, come inside." The inner office was small and cluttered. 2 walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling metal shelves packed with black leather ledger, books, and cardboard file boxes. A large, dark mahogany conference table sat in the center of the room, its surface cleared of everything except a green felt blotter, a brass inkwell, and a heavy, cast-iron notary seal that looked like a miniature printing press. Beatrice sat in the high-backed wooden chair Mr. Davis pulled out for her. The wood was cold, pressing hard against her spine. Donald and Clara sat opposite her, their chairs scraping softly against the thin carpet. Mr. Davis sat at the head of the table. He took the blue folder from Donald's portfolio, sliding the thick, white pages of the durable power of attorney document onto the green felt blotter. He flipped to the signature page, then looked over his bifocals at Beatrice. "Now, Miss Vance," Mr. Davis said, his voice dry and slow. "Before we begin, I need to verify your identity. Do you have your state-issued identification?" Beatrice reached into her pocket. She had taken her ID card out of her handbag before entering the office, keeping it ready. She laid the small plastic card on the green felt blotter. Mr. Davis picked up the card, squinting at the photograph, then at Beatrice's face. He nodded, tapping his pen against his desk. "All right," he said. "Beatrice Clara Vance. And you are here today to execute a durable power of attorney, granting Donald Vance the full, unrestricted authority to act as your attorney in fact for all financial, legal, and real property transactions?" Yes, Beatrice said. Do you understand? Mr. Davis continued, his voice falling into a rote, administrative drone, that by signing this document, you are giving Donald Vance the power to manage your bank accounts, pay your bills, and execute contracts, including the sale or transfer of real property, in your name. Beside her, Clara's breathing was shallow and rapid. Her fingers were laced together so tightly her knuckles were white. Donald sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the blue folder, his mouth slightly open as if he were holding his breath. Yes, Beatrice said, her voice a quiet, unblinking whisper. I understand perfectly. And you are executing this document of your own free will without any coercion or duress. Beatrice looked across the dark mahogany table. She looked at Donald. She saw the tiny rhythmic twitch of his left eye, the desperate, hungry tension in his jaw, and the dark, faint shadow of the grease spot on his gray lapel. She looked at Clara, whose eyes were wide, shining with the glittering, hollow anticipation of her new townhouse. They believed they had won. They believed this signed piece of paper was the final key that would unlock her father's house and slide $3 million into their hands. I am signing of my own free will, Beatrice said. Mr. Davis slid the document across the green felt blotter toward her. He uncapped a heavy gold and black fountain pen and handed it to her. The pen was heavy, its metal casing cold against her thumb. Beatrice took the pen. She did not hesitate. She placed the gold nib on the dotted line marked signature of principal. With slow, elegant cursive, her hand remarkably steady, she signed her name, Beatrice Clara Vance. The dark blue ink flowed smoothly onto the thick paper, drying almost instantly. Mr. Davis took the document back. He checked the signature, then picked up the heavy cast-iron notary seal from the corner of the table. He slid
The bottom page of the document under the metal plate, grabbed the lever and pressed down with a sharp, heavy effort.
thud-clack. The metal seal crimped the paper, leaving a raised, circular emblem of the state's authority pressed permanently into the fiber. He signed his own name beneath her signature, stamped it with his red ink pad, and slid the paper back into the blue folder. We're done, mister, Davis said, handing the blue folder to Donald. The document is executed and active as of today, Friday, June 7, 2026. Donald exhaled a long, shuddering breath. His shoulders visibly dropped, and a wide, triumphant grin split his face. He stood up, offering his hand to Mr. Davis. Thank you, Walter. Truly, I appreciate your help with this. Of course, Donald, Mr. Davis said, shaking his hand before nodding to Beatrice. Have a good afternoon, Miss Vance. Thank you, Mr. Davis, Beatrice said. She stood up, her charcoal skirt falling neatly into place. She picked up her black leather handbag from the vinyl chair. Clara stood beside her, her face glowing with a frantic, euphoric energy. She reached out and wrapped both hands around Beatrice's arm, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. Oh, Beatrice, it's all done. It's such a relief, isn't it? Come on, let's go celebrate. Donald has that reservation at the bistro, and they have the most wonderful lemon tart. My treat! Beatrice let Clara guide her out of the office and down the cold, damp stairwell. As they stepped back onto 4th Street, the cold drizzle had stopped, replaced by a pale, weak sun that broke through the gray clouds. Donald walked ahead of them, his leather portfolio tucked securely under his arm, his head held high as he unlocked his sedan. He had the signed power of attorney. He had the legal authority to act on her behalf. But as Beatrice sat in the passenger seat of his car, her handbag resting on her knees, she felt only the cold, hard weight of her own folder tucked inside. On Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, the bank's appraiser would walk through her empty house. By Friday, the $1.2 million lump sum would hit her private account, and the bank's primary lien would lock onto the title of 412 Alder Street. Donald had his signed paper, but she had the house, she had the cash, and she had just given him the exact illusion of victory he needed. to ensure he would never see the trap snap shut until it was far too late to run. The celebratory lunch at the bistro had ended at 4 o'clock. Beatrice had sat quietly in the velvet-upholstered booth, her small glass of water untouched, watching Donald and Clara toast each other with glasses of expensive Chardonnay. Donald had placed his leather portfolio on the seat beside him, patting it occasionally as if it were a sleeping child. They had talked over her, around her, and through her, discussing the paint colors for the girls' future townhouses, while Beatrice politely declined a slice of the famous lemon tart. Now, back at 412 Alder Street, the house was dark and cold. Donald walked through the front door first, his face flushed with wine and triumph. He set his briefcase on the foyer table, tossed his leather portfolio beside it, and began unbuttoning his gray wool coat. "A good day's work," he said, his voice echoing in the high ceiling of the hall. "A very good day's work." Beatrice did not reply. She quietly hung her beige trench coat on its peg, slipped into her soft wool slippers, and began her slow climb up the stairs. She stepped carefully on the outer left edge of the 5th tread, her body weight balanced, her hand gliding along the mahogany rail. Below her, Clara walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. "Donald, did you move the apple crates out to the garage?" Clara's voice was loud, carrying a thin, sharp thread of confusion from the pantry. Beatrice stopped on the landing, her hand resting on the polished wood. She turned slightly, looking down into the dim hallway. "What?" Donald called back, his voice muffled as he walked into the parlor to pour himself a whiskey. "No, why would I touch those heavy things? I've been with you the whole afternoon." "Well, they're not in the pantry," Clara said. Her slippers scuffed rapidly across the kitchen floor. "I left all 4 boxes of bubble-wrapped china right here by the bread box yesterday morning. They're gone. And the 3 leather suitcases that were under the stairs, they're gone too." "Maybe the girls moved them to clear some space," Donald said, stepping into the kitchen with his whiskey glass. "Chloe, Maeve, we didn't touch your stupid boxes." Chloe's voice drifted down from her bedroom on the 3rd floor, loud and irritated. "We've been out since 10. We just got back." A heavy, sudden silence fell over the kitchen. Beatrice stood on the landing, her expression entirely serene, her unblinking eyes watching the kitchen doorway. From the dining room, a loud, wooden scrape echoed through the house. It was the sound of the walnut sideboard doors being flung open with violent haste. "Donald!" Clara's scream was high, shrill, and laced with a sudden, suffocating panic. "The silver! The drawer is completely empty." The sound of Donald's heavy footsteps shook the floorboards as he ran from the kitchen into the dining room. Beatrice heard the frantic, metallic sliding of the empty sideboard drawers, the dry rustle of the bare green felt slots where the 72 pieces of Grand Baroque flatware had rested for 30 years. "What do you mean, empty?" Donald's voice rose, his smooth, patronizing tone completely shattered. "Clara, did you pack the silver into the crates? You said you only did the china." "I didn't touch the silver," Clara shouted, her voice trembling. "I told you, I only did the plates. The silver was supposed to stay in the sideboard until the estate planners came next week. Donald, where is it? Where is everything?" The sound of their frantic, heavy breathing carried up the open stairwell. Then came the footsteps, loud, rapid, and heavy, charging up the wooden stairs. Donald reached the landing, his face a deep, blotchy red, his left eye twitching violently. Clara followed close behind him, her manicured fingers gripping the collar of her cream coat, her eyes wide and wet with a sudden wild suspicion. They stopped on the landing, staring up at Beatrice, who stood 3 steps above them, her hands folded neatly over her charcoal skirt. "Aunt Bea," Donald stammered, his voice shaking as he tried, and failed to force his soft, protective smile onto his face. "Aunt Bea, where is the silver? And the china? Clara says the boxes are gone from the pantry. Did you have someone move them?" Yes, Beatrice said softly. Her voice was flat, calm, and entirely steady. I had them moved. Donald blinked, his jaw dropping slightly. He looked at Clara, then back at Beatrice. Moved? Moved where? Who moved them? I hired Toby, Beatrice said, her unblinking gaze holding his. The neighbor's grandson. He came with his truck this morning while you were at your meeting, and Clara was at her appointment. Hired him? Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. To take them where, Beatrice? Those are family heirlooms. You can't just give them away to the neighbors. I didn't give them away, Beatrice said. They are in a safe place, since we are planning for the future. And you told me the house needs to be completely clear of clutter. I decided to begin the process. I wanted to save your strength, Clara. Donald took a step up the stairs, his leather portfolio trembling in his hand. But Aunt Bea, we need to know where they are. For the inventory. For the insurance. They are perfectly secure, Donald, Beatrice said. You don't need to worry about them. Beatrice, tell us where they are right now, Clara shouted, her self-control slipping entirely, her voice shrill and ugly in the quiet house. We have the legal authority now. Donald has the power of attorney. You have to tell us. Beatrice looked down at Clara. She saw the raw, naked greed in her sister-in-law's eyes, the desperate, ugly panic of a thief who had just realized the vault was empty. The power of attorney, Beatrice murmured, her voice dropping into a quiet, icy whisper, gives Donald the authority to act on my behalf. It does not give you my mother's silver, Clara, and it does not make my things yours. She turned, walked the final 3 steps to her bedroom door, and stepped inside. Beatrice! Donald yelled, lunging up the stairs after her. Before he could reach the door, Beatrice closed it. She turned the key in the heavy mortise lock. The brass bolt slid home with a deep, final clack. Bang, bang, bang. Donald rattled the brass doorknob, his fist hammering against the thick oak panel. Aunt Bea, open this door. We're trying to help you. You're not acting rationally. Open the door. Beatrice did not reply. She walked to her rocking chair, sat down, and smoothed her skirt over her knees. Downstairs, the storm broke. Through her black iron heating grate, the voices of her family rose. No longer hushed, no longer polite. They had turned on each other, the quiet buffer of her gentle compliance completely gone. I told you she was hiding things, Clara screamed, her voice echoing in the empty dining room. I told you she was getting paranoid. Who did she talk to, Donald? Who told her to move the silver? What if she talked to a lawyer? What if she's hiding other things? Shut up, Clara, Donald shouted back, his voice cracked with stress. We have the signed POA. It's notarized. It doesn't matter if she hid some old plates and a couple of forks. The house is what matters. On Tuesday, we sign the preliminary contract with the developer, and then she has to move anyway. Let her keep her stupid silver in some garage. It's worthless compared to $3 million. But what if she won't leave? Clara cried. What if she locks herself in that room? Then we'll have her declared incompetent. Donald slammed his fist onto the dining table. The doctor will sign the papers. We have the POA. We'll have her moved to Sunnyvale by next weekend. Just ignore her, Clara. Don't touch her room. Just let her sit up there until Tuesday. Beatrice sat in her rocking chair, her face illuminated by the weak gray light of the window. She did not feel fear. She did not feel anger. She felt only a deep, quiet, and utterly suffocating sense of triumph. They were screaming. They were panic-stricken. And they were turning on each other. And they still had absolutely no idea that the real trap hadn't even begun to close. By Monday, the silence in the house had turned into something thick, heavy, and freezing. Donald, Clara, and the girls had stopped trying to speak to Beatrice. When they crossed paths in the hallway or the kitchen, they looked right through her, treating her like a draft of cold air or a shadow on the wallpaper. Beatrice went about her quiet routines. She boiled her single egg in the mornings, made her simple tea, and spent the weekends sitting by her window, watching the rain wash the dust off the lilac bushes in the garden below. Now it was Tuesday morning, 9:50. Beatrice stood in the center of her bedroom. Her beige trench coat was buttoned to her throat, and her black leather handbag was tucked securely under her arm. Beside the door sat her 3 vintage cowhide suitcases, their green tarnished brass buckles glinting in the pale morning light. Overhead, the floorboards in the hallway were quiet. Downstairs, she could hear Donald pacing. His leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the parlor floor. Clack, 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 a frantic, uneven cadence. The developer's preliminary contract lay on the coffee table, a stack of crisp white papers waiting for Donald's signature under the authority of his new power of attorney. He had been on the phone since 8 o'clock, his voice hushed and trembling with a desperate, greedy energy. At exactly 10 o'clock, a firm, heavy knock echoed through the front door. The pacing in the parlor stopped instantly. Beatrice heard Donald's hurried, heavy footsteps charge toward the foyer, the brass lock turning with a sharp, victorious scrape. "Richard? You're early," Donald said, his voice loud, carrying a breathless, triumphant relief. "Good morning." "No, my name is Henderson," a deep, professional voice replied from the porch. "I'm here from Apex Trust. I have a 10 o'clock appointment for the property appraisal." A long, suffocating silence fell over the foyer. Beatrice stepped out of her bedroom. She walked down the dark stairs, her movements slow and deliberate, her hand gliding along the polished mahogany rail. She did not step on the outer left edge of the 5th tread today. She stepped right in the center, letting the wood groan loudly under her weight. In the foyer, Donald stood frozen by the open front door. His face was a pale, blotchy gray, his mouth hanging slightly open. Opposite him stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark trench coat, carrying a leather-bound clipboard and a professional digital camera. This was Mr. Henderson, the independent appraiser Matthew had scheduled. "Apex Trust?" Donald whispered, his voice cracking, his left eye twitching so violently the skin of his temple seemed to vibrate. He clutched his developer's contract against his chest like a shield. "I'm sorry. There must be a mistake. We didn't schedule an appraisal with Apex. We're working with a private developer. We have the power of attorney." "There is no mistake, Donald," Beatrice said. She stepped off the last stair, her soft slippers silent on the runner rug. She stood in the hallway, her black handbag resting on her arm, her unblinking eyes fixed on her nephew's face. Donald spun around, his chest heaving, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Aunt Bea, what is he talking about? What is Apex Trust doing here?" From the kitchen, Clara walked into the hallway, a half-empty mug of coffee in her hand. When she saw the appraiser's clipboard and Beatrice's packed suitcases sitting, visible at the top of the landing, she stopped, her eyes widening with a sudden, wild terror. "Mr. Henderson is here on my behalf," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a quiet, flat whisper that seemed to echo in the high-ceilinged foyer. "He is conducting the mandatory independent appraisal for my reverse mortgage." You're what?" Donald's voice rose to a shriek. He took a frantic step toward her, his leather portfolio slipping from his hand and clattering onto the floorboards. "Aunt Bea, you can't do that. I have the power of attorney. It was notarized on Friday. I have the legal authority to block any financial transactions on this house. You have the authority to act on my behalf, Donald," Beatrice said, her expression entirely serene, her face a calm, unmoving mask. But the reverse mortgage application was executed, signed, and locked into the Apex Trust database last Tuesday. The title search was completed, and the underwriting was approved before you ever stepped into the notary's office. She looked at the white paper contract in his hand. "And even if you try to use your paper," Beatrice continued, her voice remaining cold and steady, "any transfer of this deed requires clearing the bank's primary lien. By Friday, Apex Trust will disburse a lump sum of $1.2 million directly into my private money market account. The moment that cash lands, the bank holds a primary, non-negotiable lien of $1.2 million on the title of 412 Alder Street. Donald stared at her, his face completely drained of color, his chest heaving as if he had been struck in the ribs. $1.2 million? But the developer, they won't buy a property with a federal lien on it. They wanted a clean acquisition. No, Beatrice said, they won't buy it. If they want the lot, they will have to pay off the bank's $1.2 million debt first, which means your $3 million payout is gone. There is no townhouse for the girls, Donald. There is no townhouse for Clara. Clara let out a low, choking sob, her coffee mug slipping from her fingers and shattering against the oak floor. The dark brown liquid pooled around her slippers, but she didn't move. She stared at Beatrice with a raw, wild horror, her manicured hands clawing at her face. You ruined us, Clara whispered, her voice cracked and trembling. We spent 7 years taking care of you. We lived here. We packed the china. We did everything. You lived here rent-free for 84 months, Beatrice said, her unblinking gaze shifting to Clara. You spent 7 years waiting for me to die, so you could sell my grandfather's house to a developer. You planned to put me in a shared room in the cheap wing of Sunnyvale so you could pocket $60,000 a year. She took her father's heavy brass key from her handbag, holding it out to Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, you may begin your inspection, Beatrice said, her voice calm and professional. Every room is open. The attic, the basement, and the bedrooms. The house is exactly as it was, though the silver is gone. Thank you, Miss Vance, the appraiser said, taking the key and stepping past the frozen, silent figures of Donald and Clara. His boots clicked rhythmically against the floorboards as he walked toward the parlor. Donald stood in the center of the foyer, his eyes fixed on the empty floorboards where his portfolio lay open, the white pages of his developer's contract soaking up Clara's spilled coffee. He looked up at Beatrice, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He looked like an old man now, soft, defeated, and entirely empty. The lump sum will be deposited on Friday, Beatrice said, her voice a quiet, final whisper. I believe Toby will be back with his truck on Friday morning to help me carry my bags to the station. My cruise departs from New York on Sunday. She looked around the high-ceilinged hallway. She looked at the cracked plaster, the peeling wallpaper, and the damp draft rising from the basement. You are welcome to stay here, Donald, Beatrice said, her voice holding a deep, suffocating sense of complete psychological dominance. The roof still leaks, the gutters are still rotting, and the property taxes are due in November. I'm sure your power of attorney will be very helpful when you try to pay them. She turned, walked back up the stairs, and stepped onto the landing. She did not lock her door. She did not need to. The house was empty. The trap had snapped shut, and she was finally, completely, and utterly free. The Friday morning sun broke through the gray canopy of clouds, casting long golden needles of light across the front porch of 412 Alder Street. The air was crisp, smelling of washed stone, wet earth, and the faint, sweet scent of pine. Inside, the house was entirely silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a waiting trap. It was the vast, empty silence of a stage after the actors had realized the play was over. Beatrice walked down the dark stairs for the last time. She was dressed in her charcoal wool coat, her silk scarf tied neatly at her throat, her structured black leather handbag held firmly under her arm. On the landing behind her, Toby was already carrying her 3 vintage cowhide suitcases down, his heavy boots making a slow, respectful thud on the wood. In the dining room, Donald and Clara sat at the walnut table. They looked as if they had not slept in days. The developer's preliminary contract lay on the table between them, crumpled and stained with rings of cold coffee. Surrounding it were stacks of older utility bills, property tax assessments, and a letter from a real estate attorney they had frantically consulted over the weekend. A letter that confirmed, in cold legal terms, that Beatrice's reverse mortgage was ironclad, registered, and entirely beyond their power to challenge. They had the power of attorney. They had the legal right to sign documents on her behalf. But there was nothing left to sign. The equity of the house had been completely hollowed out, replaced by a $1, $2 million federal debt that they would have to settle themselves if they ever wanted to sell the land. Donald did not look up as Beatrice entered the room. He sat with his chin resting in his hand, his hair uncombed, his gray suit jacket thrown carelessly over the back of a chair. His left eye was still, the twitch finally gone, replaced by a dull, vacant stare that fixed on the empty walnut cabinet across the room. Clara looked up. Her face was haggard, her eyes hollow and rimmed with red. She looked at Beatrice's elegant coat, her neat hair, and the pristine leather handbag. "Where are you going?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper, thin and dry like autumn leaves. Beatrice stopped by the doorway. She looked at her sister-in-law, her expression entirely serene, her unblinking eyes holding no malice, no anger, and no triumph. "My train leaves at 11, Beatrice said softly. "Toby is taking me to the station." You're just leaving us here?" Clara's voice trembled, a faint, desperate edge of her old indignation rising, but it quickly fell away into a pathetic, helpless sob. "With this house? The roof is leaking. Beatrice. The plumber said the main line needs to be replaced. It's going to cost thousands. We don't have the money." Beatrice adjusted her leather glove, smoothing the wool over her knuckles.
The water shutoff is behind the coal bunker, Clara,
Beatrice said, her voice a quiet, calm vibration in the cold room. "I'm sure Donald can find it now." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked out of the dining room, her soft slippers silent on the runner rug. She stepped through the heavy front door, onto the porch, and down the slick concrete steps into the bright cold morning. The ride to the train station was peaceful. Toby drove his small black truck with a quiet care, the engine humming a steady, rhythmic song as the old Victorian house faded into the distance behind them, swallowed up by the sterile glass walls of the modern condominiums. At the station, Toby loaded her 3 vintage suitcases onto a brass luggage cart. He pulled off his knit cap, offering her a shy, warm smile. "Have a wonderful trip, Miss Vance," Toby said. "You deserve it." "Thank you, Toby," Beatrice said. She reached into her handbag and slipped a $100 bill into his hand, patting his fingers gently. "Take care of your grandfather." She walked into the terminal, her heels clicking softly on the polished terrazzo floor. Inside the first-class waiting lounge, Beatrice sat in a deep, buttery leather armchair. She pulled her new smartphone from her handbag, the one she had quietly purchased on Wednesday. She tapped the screen, opening the private Apex Trust mobile application. The balance in her high-yield money market account was printed in neat green numbers, 1,203,500. Beatrice looked at the numbers for a long, silent moment. She did not smile. She simply closed the application, slipped the phone back into her bag, and leaned her head against the soft leather of the chair. Outside the wide glass window of the lounge, the silver train hissed to a stop, its engine humming with a low, powerful vibration. The conductor's voice chimed over the loudspeaker, calling for first-class passengers to board the express to New York. The quiet aunt who had spent her life sweeping up the dust of others stood up, smoothed her coat, and walked toward the gate, stepping out into a world that was finally completely and beautifully her own. And so, the silent architect of Alder Street walked into her own sunlit horizon, leaving behind a hollowed-out empire built on greed. The tap had finally run dry, and the family, who had viewed her care as a natural resource, was left to drown in the quiet wreckage of their own ambition. If you found Beatrice's meticulous, silent triumph satisfying, and if you believe that justice is a dish best served with absolute, chilling patience, then take a moment to join our community of quiet observers. Subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on Beatrice's ultimate accounting. By subscribing, you ensure that you will never miss our next journey into the deepest, most devastating corners of human psychology and quiet strategy. Thank you for listening. And until the next trap snaps shut, keep watching the silent architects of the world.